Good people are rarely suspicious. They cannot imagine others doing the things they themselves are incapable of doing. Then, too, the normal are inclined to visualize the psychopath as one who's as monstrous in appearance as he is in mind, which is about as far from the truth as one could well get. These monsters of real life usually looked and behaved in a more normal manner than their actually normal brothers and sisters. They presented a more convincing picture of virtue than virtue presented of itself. Just as the wax rosebud or the plastic peach seemed more perfect to the eye, more what the mind thought a rosebud or a peach should be, than the imperfect original from which it has been modeled. William March, The Bad Seed. Psychopaths are social predators who charm, manipulate, and ruthlessly plow their way through life, leaving a broad trail of broken hearts, shattered expectations, and empty wallets. Completely lacking in conscience and in feeling for others, they selfishly take what they want and do as they please, violating social norms and expectations without the slightest sense of guilt or regret. Robert Hare, Without Conscience. Deceit can be an art form. I was simply an artist. Lies can build an empire if you're brave enough to live in them. John Wayne Gacy. It is easier to fool a man than to convince him that he has been fooled. Mark Twain. Greetings and salutations, scholar warriors and fellow travelers. It is I, CJ, your humble hazardous history host, back with another dastardly dose of dangerous history. This is Dangerous History Podcast episode 283. We are ruled by psychopaths. I was inspired to start working on this episode several weeks ago, when I watched a few episodes of the true crime drama Devil in Disguise about John Wayne Gacy, which is on Peacock. And even more so when I watched the accompanying documentary about Gacy on Peacock, which featured a lot of clips of him actually talking and being interviewed. And I was familiar before with the basic story of John Wayne Gacy, like a lot of people. I've always had a weird fascination with serial killers. But this was the first time I really looked at a lot of the details about him. And it was just incredible that this guy was able to get away with so much that he was able to get away with, despite repeatedly coming into contact with the law in various ways, and despite a lot of people around him having what should have been good reason to at least have been very suspicious about him. And he's one of the most interesting serial killers that I'm aware of. Most people just have kind of a caricature of him as, oh, he was a killer clown. But that's really a gross oversimplification that tries to fit him into some kind of horror movie tropes. It tends to leave people thinking that he was something like a non-supernatural version of Pennywise in It. And that's very far from the truth. To many people in his community, he was a highly respected, seemingly very successful small businessman who was very prominent in a number of kind of civic organizations and things, as well as in Democratic Party politics in his area of, I forget the town, but it's basically like a suburb of Chicago. He had a lot of powerful friends and acquaintances in the Chicago area. And it definitely seems like at least some of the reason he was able to get away with horrible stuff for so long was because he was at least to some degree protected by somebody. To people who only knew him in a relatively superficial social context, he seemed to be an extremely charming and likable guy. Someone already on the make as a successful business owner and seemingly a rising star within local politics. And yet this was a guy who murdered something like, 33, 34 people that we know of? Most of whom he buried on his own property, and a few of which he disposed of elsewhere once he started running out of room to bury bodies on his own property. Most of them in his basement, and one or two of them, I believe, he buried under his driveway. And in particular, in the Gacy documentary, where you actually see the man himself, speaking extensively in interviews and things, it struck me that a lot of Gacy's personality traits, and especially his way of speaking and his way of handling interviews, was very reminiscent of many politicians. And in particular, I was struck by a lot of his similarities in terms of how he speaks and how he does these sort of performances in interviews and conversations that are very similar to Donald Trump in particular. And of course, given a lot of Trump's recent behavior regarding everything from Venezuela to his, sucking up to Miriam Adelson and the hardcore Zionist movement and his blatant snubbing of kind of the real grassroots America First movement in terms of issues and policies, along with things like how he responded to pushback on a few issues from people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Thomas Massie. And a little bit more recently, things like how he responded to the death of Rob Reiner on social media. A lot of his overall methods and approaches to communicating are eerily similar to John Wayne Gacy, even though the two guys, because of very different backgrounds, have very different, accents and speaking cadences and things. But if you look at it in terms of how they respond to criticism, how they respond to questioning, how they deflect blame and responsibility constantly, how they will just go off on wild, unrelated tangents in order to oftentimes just brag about themselves in some way. And the ways that they will just blatantly lie in ways that should be easy for anyone paying attention to detect, sometimes even contradicting themselves, like exposing the fact that either what they just said a few minutes ago was a lie or what they're saying right now is a lie because the two things contradict each other very blatantly, or the way they will blatantly lie and exaggerate about things that are easily checked, fact-checked in the real sense of the word. So I decided that I would make this episode, and I've talked about psychopathy on some old DHP episodes, and I've said many times on the podcast and on social media everywhere, that I've expressed my views about these sorts of things, that I honestly believe that we are ruled by psychopaths. I honestly believe that most of our high-level politicians and the corporate oligarchs that act as their puppet masters are genuinely psychopaths. With all this swirling around in my mind, I decided, it's time to just do a whole DHP episode where I dig into the reality of what a psychopath is, and why there's good reason to believe that a significant percentage of our top-level rulers are actually psychopaths, and that explains a lot of their behavior and a lot of the damage they continue to cause. Well, anyway, the result when I finally was able to sit down and record it today, because now finally both my wife and my mom are out of the hospital. They both still have difficult and probably long recoveries ahead of them, but, they're both okay and out of the hospital, so I finally had a chance to be able to record a DHP episode. So anyway, the result of all this is what you're listening to right now. So I hope you find it interesting and enlightening. Now, I'm not saying that Donald Trump or any other prominent politician that exhibits a lot of psychopathic characteristics are actually serial killers. I mean, you could, make the argument that by starting unnecessary wars based on lies, or by using drone strikes where you're mostly just killing innocent civilians and things, that, okay, these are serial killers and mass murderers in a way. But I'm not saying these people are all a bunch of closet John Wayne Gacy's who are, murdering people and disposing of bodies in their spare time. A guy like Gacy is what a psychopath can become if he comes from a really dysfunctional and fairly humble background. From what I know, I don't think Gacy grew up in abject poverty, but he was definitely lower middle class, so he didn't get the best in education and things like that. And his father was an emotionally and physically abusive alcoholic. And based on, a little bit of research I did into Gacy's childhood, it appears that he was molested, maybe not by his father, but maybe by other family members and or family friends when he was a boy too. And so Gacy ended up being molded into what we might think of as something like a retail psychopath, by which I mean someone who is molded to indulge in things like personal violence and sadism, and eventually this escalates into being a serial killer. And I do, by the way, believe that people are born with brains that are just pre-wired for psychopathy. Some small percentage of people are just born with psychopathic brains. But how that brain is molded to actually behave and exhibit those symptoms depends a lot on how the person grows up. More on that later in this episode. But imagine, a person who's born with a brain that is pre-wired for psychopathy in the same way that Gacy's brain probably was. But imagine what would happen if that person was born and, grew up into genuine privilege in the real sense of the word. Grew up in a wealthy family that was relatively stable and comfortable without any really significant early physical or sexual abuse. And this person, grew up getting an elite education, and from his background, because of his birth and raising and his family and where he went to school, he finds himself from a young age being plugged into high society and having lots of powerful and important connections just from circumstance. Such a person would still have the same lack of empathy and morality and conscience that any psychopath has. But he'd be probably less likely to engage in personal violence, say up to the level of actually murdering people by his own hand. And while such a person would likely still engage in other forms of abuse of others, sexual abuse seems to be a very common thing for psychopaths to engage in. Such a person would, however, have the intelligence and the education, and perhaps most important of all, the connections to protect himself from having any major negative consequences for his misbehavior. Such a person would also be more likely to be involved in nonviolent or less violent crimes. They might be more likely to grow up to be a businessman who is very deceitful and manipulative and maybe even kind of a con man. And or such a person might grow up to become a very deceitful and manipulative and abusive of power politician, even more so than the run-of-the-mill kind of generic politician. So anyway, watching the stuff about John Wayne Gacy and thinking about psychopaths and psychopathy in general, and coming to the conclusion that Trump, in my opinion, is definitely either a psychopath or at the very least a sociopath. These things caused me to read cover to cover two very important books about psychopathy, books which I'd read little bits and pieces of before, but had not read all the way through until, maybe a month ago or so. So the first book is kind of like a classic on psychopathy. It is the book Without Conscience by the psychologist Robert Hare, who's been considered one of the world's leading experts on psychopaths and psychopathy for decades. And then I also read a later book that was published much more recently. I think Without Conscience was published in the 90s. This one, I think, was published only around a decade ago, so like 2010s. And this is a book that the same expert, Robert Hare, co-wrote with another psychologist named Paul Babiak, and the book is called Snakes in Suits, and it's about so-called corporate psychopaths. So watching the Gacy stuff, thinking about psychopathy in politicians, and Donald Trump as a very prominent current example of such, in my opinion, and then reading these two books on psychopathy cover to cover, all of this is what inspired and informed this episode you're listening to now. And as is often the case when I start working on a DHP episode, I initially thought that it would be a relatively brief one, and then as I started working on it, it just kind of organically grew well beyond my initial expectations and intentions. So it's going to be a longer episode than I thought it was going to be, a month or so ago, whenever it was that I started really thinking about this and working on it. So I have for many years been saying we are ruled by psychopaths, and I have always meant it, very emphatically and literally. As far as I know, I did not coin that exact phrase, but I cannot recall where it was I first, saw it or heard it, so, who knows? I would give credit if I knew. And regular and or longtime listeners to the Dangerous History podcast are probably disproportionately likely, relative to just, Gen Pop, to be at least open to agreeing with me that we are ruled by psychopaths. Though I would imagine, even now, at the end of 2025, after a zillion high-profile, obvious examples of our rulers behaving like textbook psychopaths in the last, 5-6 years especially, even so, I think that at the moment, only a very small percentage of Gen Pop would be seriously opening to entertaining my thesis. Though I admit that though it's still, I think, a small, minority percentage of Gen Pop, that percentage is probably a lot larger than it would have been 5 years ago, let alone 10 or 20. There's just something about accepting that there's good reason to suspect that a lot of our rulers in both the political and corporate worlds, which, if you haven't realized, those are not separate spheres, that those are kind of like overlapping nexuses. And you're still one of these like really simple-minded libertarians who just thinks private sector good, public sector bad. And so that, anything that a corporation that's nominally private does has to be okay and even good. And, anything the government does is bad. And it's like, well, you're only half right. The American system is a corporatist oligarchical system, and it has been for a very long time, since long before any of us were born. And so if you still think in these clear distinctions between, the government and the corporate world, between the public sector and the private sector, I think you're just missing a huge amount of what our system is and how it really operates. And I will admit that, more people are probably open to the idea that a lot of corporate CEOs of giant corporations might be psychopaths. But there's something about the notion that there's good reason to believe that a hell of a lot of our high-level politicians are psychopaths as well. There's something about that more people have a hard time believing than believing that, a disproportionate number of high-level giant corporate CEOs are psychopaths. So in thinking about this, I came up with what I think are three main reasons why most people who are still largely in kind of the blue-pilled masses of Gen Pop, right? The people who are not radical anti-establishmentarians, like myself and probably yourself if you listen to my show a lot. Why those blue-pilled masses are even now so resistant to entertaining the possibility that we're ruled by psychopaths. Reason number one, I think, is that most people just do not have anything like an accurate understanding of what a psychopath is and what psychopathy, the condition, is. Partly, I believe, this is just due to an unfortunate situation in the terminology. The word psychopath looks and sounds very similar to another psychology word, which is psychotic. And a lot of times what people sort of picture in their minds when they think of psychopath is actually something that's more characteristic of someone who's psychotic. And those two words, psychopath and psychotic, mean very different things. But because they look and sound very similar, I think people often unknowingly confuse the two terms. And on top of that, it's muddied even further by the fact that both of those terms are often abbreviated, colloquially in conversation, simply as the term psycho. And so people will say, so-and-so is a psycho, or man, the other day so-and-so really went psycho. And it's not always clear, and in most cases, the person saying this probably themselves doesn't know which they really mean. Psychotic or psychopathic? So let's define our terms. A person who is psychotic, meaning that they're suffering from the condition known as psychosis, is a person who is significantly disconnected from reality and has significant trouble doing things like differentiating between fantasies and delusions from cold hard reality. They may even be literally experiencing various types of hallucinations. My understanding is that the serial killer Ed Gein was most likely psychotic. By contrast, the term psychopath, meaning a person who has the condition of psychopathy, is someone who is very much plugged into cold hard reality. They absolutely know what is real and what is not. They just lack anything like a conscience or empathy. My understanding is that John Wayne Gacy and Ted Bundy, for two famous examples, were psychopaths, but not psychotic. In the world of famous fictional serial killers, I would say that Hannibal Lecter is a psychopath. However, Norman Bates is not. Norman Bates, at least as portrayed in the original 1960 Hitchcock film Psycho, seems to be psychotic, but not a psychopath. Bates is depicted as suffering from severe delusions, including outright hallucinations. There's a lot in that movie that indicates he's psychotic. There's not much that indicates he's a psychopath. And of course, the fact that that film's title is just Psycho probably has just added over the last, 65 years to the confusion in the popular mind between the terms psychotic and psychopath. And I think another thing that unfortunately causes a lot of people to not really have an accurate idea of what a psychopath is and what psychopathy is that the psychopaths who are depicted, sometimes pretty accurately, in popular movies and TV, whether, documentary or kind of historical drama or pure fiction, the psychopaths who are depicted in those media are almost always outliers. They're like extreme cases even amongst psychopaths, and most often they're actual serial killers. And I think that this gives the mistaken impression to the public that the word psychopath is pretty much a synonym for serial killer. But of course, this is not true. Not all psychopaths are serial killers, and not all serial killers are psychopaths. And while there's a lot of evidence that psychopaths are disproportionately represented amongst criminals, especially amongst repeat violent criminals, not all psychopaths are physically violent at all. So again, you can kind of see all of this confusion about what the term even means in the popular phrases like so-and-so is a psycho or so-and-so went psycho, which usually when someone says that in conversation means that whoever they're talking about really lost their temper, usually in a very loud, kind of disproportionate way to whatever it was they were angry about, and it was maybe even kind of scary, maybe even, you were worried that they were going to get violent, or they did get violent, or they were, punching through a wall or whatever. So-and-so is a psycho. Now, this sort of behavior of suddenly getting crazy angry and even, physically dangerously so can be a thing that a person who's suffering from psychosis does. Although not all people who are psychotic or suffering from psychosis get, crazy, angry, and violent and whatever. But that sort of behavior is rarely exhibited by psychopaths, even ones who actually are violent. Their violence is usually surprisingly cold and instrumental and not emotionally charged. A lot of the violence that psychopaths commit is almost, clinical. And while they seem to be getting some kind of pleasure out of it, they're not usually, frothing at the mouth, angry or whatever, while they're hurting someone or killing someone. So again, most psychopaths are not serial killers. And many of them aren't even physically violent, at least not on a regular basis or on like an extreme basis of killing people or nearly killing people. As psychopathy expert Robert Hare puts it in Without Conscience, quote, "Psychopaths are not disoriented or out of touch with reality, nor do they experience the delusions, hallucinations, or intense subjective distress that characterize most other mental disorders. Unlike psychotic individuals, psychopaths are rational and aware of what they are doing and why. Their behavior is the result of choice, freely exercised." End quote. So that's my first reason that I think that people amongst kind of the blue-pilled gen pop are resistant to entertaining the idea that perhaps a significant percentage of our rulers are psychopaths. They simply don't have an accurate understanding of what the term even means. The second reason is I think that even if someone has read like definitions of a psychopath and seen a few movies in which like non-violent, non-serial killer psychopaths are depicted accurately, and so like intellectually they kind of know what a psychopath is and can give you a definition that's more or less accurate, still I don't think most people have ever really sat down and thought about like what it would be like to be a person like that, and just how different they are in terms of how they think and act. Because when we're building a theory of mind of another person, we tend to, unless we sort of train our minds to really try to put ourselves in completely different, people's shoes and to understand the brains of people who brains that just work very differently from ours, we generally have a tendency to kind of assume that most people are more or less like us. And so we think like, oh, if I can't imagine doing such and such in so-and-so circumstances, then clearly that person can't. In other words, my second reason most people are not very open to my thesis in this episode is that most people aren't, thankfully, psychopaths. And so, unless they've really spent time studying these things and really thinking about them, they have a hard time really understanding what one is and how their mind works, even if they could give you a fairly accurate definition of psychopathy. So, as Robert Hare writes, quote, "For those of us who have been successfully socialized, imagining the world as the psychopath experiences it is close to impossible." End quote. Probably around 95% of the overall population are not genuine psychopaths. So they have some sort of a conscience. Now that conscience may be very flawed. It may be very, broken due to experiences. It may be distorted due to, bad beliefs and a whole bunch of other things, growing up in a very dysfunctional family or a very screwed up culture can cause a non-psychopath to have a really, warped conscience, but they still have a conscience. Most normal people simply have never really done serious research and reading and thinking about what a psychopath really is. And they don't even have, in many cases, the crappy kind of pop psychology notions of it the way they might about ADHD or autism or something like that. And so they just don't really understand what a psychopath is. As a result, they really can't put themselves in a psychopath's shoes, mentally speaking. They really can't grasp what it would be like to be a person who genuinely has no real conscience at all, and who sees all other human beings purely as means to be exploited if, they can get something that they want out of them, or discarded if they can't. The truth is that psychopaths are really like predators. And all of us normal people who are afflicted with consciences are no different in their eyes from the way an antelope appears to a lion. It's almost like they're a different species, psychopaths, that they're not really human, as most of us normies would understand the term, what it means to be human. And then the third and final reason that I think that people are particularly resistant to seriously consider the possibility that we are in fact ruled by psychopaths is that most people have massive, unresolved cognitive dissonance about the moral status of politicians. Now, here's what I mean by this. I think it's likely that a big majority of just, a random sample of people, if you ask them sort of abstractly, are politicians generally as a group exemplars of moral virtue who tend to be superior morally to just regular average people? I think a huge majority of people would answer something along the lines of, fuck no, they're a bunch of liars and they're corrupt and, so on and so forth. But if you went very skillfully Socratic and you asked them more questions to really kind of dig into what they really believe in detail, I think most of them would pretty quickly start making so many exceptions to their belief in the moral inferiority of politicians as a group that their initial broad brush statement of they're a bunch of corrupt liars, etc., would be basically largely nullified. This, I believe, is deliberately encouraged by the psychopaths who, in fact, rule us due to, number one, propaganda, right? Everything from history and civics school classes and textbooks to kind of popular history documentaries and books to popular depictions of politicians in even fictional TV shows and movies, right? I mean, for every Wag the Dog or House of Cards that shows politicians as complete scumbags, there are countless West Wings and things like that that show that, yeah, there's a few bad apples in politics, but there are some that are true moral exemplars and they can actually get into positions of power like president, and most of them are at least decent. And in things that, claim to be depicting actual history, the impression is often given that most American presidents, for example, have ranged from at least kind of benignly mediocre to good to downright great. And that really there are only a handful of bad apples to point out, and, they can usually be counted on the fingers of one hand. And the way those handful of, establishment-approved bad apples are often pointed out, right? Nixon being the most famous example, and, a handful of other presidents that are considered, downright bad. The way that those are pointed out and treated as if they are extremely rare exceptions strongly implies to the mind of the propaganda recipient that really those handful of bad apples just make the good and great ones shine even brighter as noble exemplars that we should build monuments to and name shit after. And another reason that people tend to have massive unresolved cognitive dissonance about the moral status of politicians is sort of a combination of two very powerful forces, a combination of partisan politics and cults of personality. Now, as I've talked about on multiple occasions on this podcast over the years, a two-party system is really a brilliant divide and rule strategy because it ensures that at any given time, at least around 40% of the population are going to support the current administration no matter what, if for no other reason than the classic lesser evil argument. And then added to that, cults of personality around specific individuals cause people who believe in those individuals to be willing to surrender their own, self-proclaimed principles and values and ideology, as well as in the process their integrity, and to mindlessly keep supporting a particular politician or that politician's administration or party even after it blatantly violates its own stated principles, platform, and ideology countless times. The examples of this are countless, but just to take a few recent ones, look at how most Democrats kept ardently supporting Barack Obama, even after he constantly betrayed his own campaign rhetoric and promises, and actually ended up behaving a lot more like George W. Bush than he behaved like what he campaigned as, or what most liberals would have said they wanted in, say, 2008. Or even more recently, how many, of course not all, but probably still a majority, at least as of the present, of Trump supporters have continued to support him, despite the fact that in less than a year back in office, he has massively betrayed almost everything he ran on and was elected on in 2024. So when you combine a personality cult with mindless, zealous partisanship, you really create a perfect storm where at least 40%, and often more than that, in the case of a popular president, will refuse to ever see the psychology of their own side's leader. And if they do admit anything, at most they will only admit that, yes, my side has some flaws, my leader has some flaws, but they will always go into lesser evils apologetics gymnastics mode. And so all this adds up to mean that while many, perhaps even most people, are willing to entertain the notion that a lot of the leaders on the other side might in fact be psychopaths, they are extremely resistant to ever seeing the same patterns on their own side, no matter how obvious and blatant those patterns might be to a genuinely objective observer. Plus, keep in mind that current era propagandists are very skilled at manipulating people to go against their own sort of common sense instinctive beliefs, even, or perhaps especially, when those beliefs are well-founded in whatever is the current specific instance that they always will claim is an exception. Now, if you don't, know what I mean by what I just said, let me give you some examples. Congress typically has an approval rating, regardless of which party is in the majority. Congress typically has an approval rating that's only slightly above the popularity of cancer. And it's been that way consistently for several decades now, at least. And yet in any given congressional election, most of the time, well over 90% of the incumbents of either party who seek to be reelected get it. Very often without a really tough contest. Now, on the surface of it, this seems to make no rational sense because you'd say, wait a minute, if like 85% of people are extremely dissatisfied with Congress, how in the hell do over 90% of them get reelected and in most cases do so pretty easily? And I think, there are, to be fair, many reasons for this phenomenon, including things like gerrymandered districts and the influences of big donors and big money and all that stuff, but part of it is also propaganda. They're willing to concede to your sort of larger, more vague view on something if they can still persuade you that there's an important exception that you need to make right now. In other words, they're fine with you thinking in an abstract way, oh yeah, Congress is mostly just a bunch of crooks, as long as you believe that your congressman is a noteworthy exception. So yeah, your congressmen and your senators are just fine with you walking around believing that most politicians, including most people in Congress, are a bunch of immoral scumbags, as long as you think that they are rare exceptions. So you'll reelect them. And it's very similar to how the warmongering corporate media and warmongering politicians are fine if most people walk around saying and believing things like the US gets into too many unnecessary foreign wars and should stop all that. They're fine with you thinking that, as long as they can still convince you that whatever war or wars they're pushing for today are important exceptions. That these wars, yes, in general, we go to war too many times for dumb reasons and blah. Yes, but this one right now that we're trying to get started is good and absolutely necessary. And we're all going to die if we don't do it. And of course, when it comes to the wars, they're okay if you later realize that that one actually was not good or necessary either. Because by then, no one really cares, and then they can say, oh yeah, that last one, oopsie, that was a blunder too. But this one is different. And if they say things like that enough times, with enough persuasiveness and enough institutional power behind them, enough people will buy it that they'll get their next wars. So anyway, we could probably come up with some other things, but I think those are some of the main reasons why people are particularly resistant to entertaining the idea that a significant number of high-level politicians appear to be psychopaths and behave like psychopaths. For a long time, the psychological and psychiatric literature and thinking on psychopathy was very flawed and misleading and incomplete. Primarily because the psychopaths who were most likely to be studied by researchers were almost all psychopaths who had ended up in prison or in some other sort of trouble with the authorities. So this led researchers to conclude for quite a long time that psychopaths pretty much always tended to be very unsuccessful in life, especially in the long term. And that they were prone to just impulsively committing constant, ill-conceived crimes for which they tended to often get caught, and that that psychopaths just in general couldn't possibly be successful in the superficial senses of, having a long-term good-paying career, of staying out of jail, and so forth. It was believed that psychopaths tended to never be good at holding jobs for very long, for example, because they would quickly be found out as immoral and dishonest and so forth, and would be fired. But in many situations, particularly in larger institutions like government agencies or politics itself or in larger corporations, this is not at all true. But a lot of people, if they know a little bit about psychopathy, still have this outdated idea in their head that psychopaths tend to be mostly kind of unsuccessful losers who are constantly getting in trouble and going to jail. Or getting fired if they, briefly have a regular job. Jordan Peterson often still espouses this very outdated notion about psychopaths, although he really should know better, and maybe he does. But, giving him the benefit of the doubt, assuming that he's not familiar with, the last 20 or 30 years of research on psychopaths who actually seem to be quite successful in life, well, maybe he could familiarize himself with all of this research if he would just stop repeating Ben Shapiro's talking points for a little while each day. Of course, the reality is that many, perhaps even the majority of psychopaths, are what we might consider high functioning. By which I mean that superficially at least, they tend to look like they are successfully functioning and maybe even really doing well in life. They may be pretty wealthy. They may have a good-paying, socially prestigious career. They may have a nice house, and they might even have what looks like from a distance a successful family. That's actually the truth of many psychopaths, possibly even most. But those superficial markers of success don't mean that they're not psychopaths still. It just means that, as compared to the psychopaths who populate prisons, these ones are smarter, or slicker, or luckier, or some combination thereof, and either they don't regularly engage in crimes that carry significant punishments, or if they do, they don't tend to get caught as often, And if they do, they have the skills and the resources and perhaps the connections to dodge or at least minimize their punishments. As Robert Hare puts it in Without Conscience, quote, "Many psychopaths never go to prison or any other facility. They appear to function reasonably well as lawyers, doctors, psychiatrists, academics, mercenaries, police officers, cult leaders, military personnel, business people, writers, artists, entertainers, and so forth, without breaking the law, or at least without being caught and convicted. These individuals are every bit as egocentric, callous, and manipulative as the average criminal psychopath. However, their intelligence, family background, social skills, and circumstances permit them to construct a facade of normalcy and to get what they want with relative impunity." End quote. So again, the popular notion of a psychopath, that of a physically and compulsively violent person, likely a serial killer, who can't really function successfully in a job and things like that, a person who is pretty much always in trouble with the law, this is simply not applicable and not true in regards to many, many psychopaths. In fact, some psychopaths appear to be the exact opposite of this popular stereotype. And it's really important to have a good understanding of psychopathy, I think, because there are a lot of psychopaths. It's true that the vast majority of people are not psychopaths, but when you're talking about a large nation or even a large city, let alone the whole planet, 4 or 5% ends up being a lot of people, and many of them are especially good at getting themselves into positions of power and influence. So they seem to be disproportionately represented in certain jobs and in certain sort of status positions, and they do a disproportionate amount of damage. Over 30 years ago, in the book Without Conscience, Robert Hare wrote that by conservative estimates, there were at the time at least 2 million psychopaths in North America, and at least 100,000 of them in New York City alone. Now, when you scale things up to the present, and account for 30 years of population growth, using that same ratio that he used 30 years ago, that means there are now 3.2 million psychopaths living in North America and at least 130,000 of them in New York City alone. And of course, it could be a bit more if you go by less conservative estimates. And honestly, I do believe that certain American cities probably have higher concentrations of psychopaths than the country at large. And the reason is because smarter and better educated psychopaths tend to always gravitate towards power. So if there was any surefire way to know, and of course there isn't, I would very much suspect that whatever the percentage is of the population who are psychopaths in just, sort of North America as a whole, that percentage is probably some amount significantly higher in, let's say, New York City, Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, and a handful of other major cities where the institutions of power and wealth and influence in this country are really concentrated. Because power corrupts, of course, but the other thing that power does is attract those who are already corrupt. And I would argue that the most corrupt people are psychopaths, by definition. So in the remainder of this episode, I'm going to go into more detail on Robert Hare's basic framework of the traits and behaviors that characterize a psychopath, because he actually developed something called the psychopathy checklist that has been fairly widely adopted as like a diagnostic and research tool. And then I'm going to dig even more into so-called corporate and white-collar psychopaths, because I think that most of our politicians are probably versions of that. So to set up for all that right now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the whole nature versus nurture thing when it comes to psychopathy. Are psychopaths born or are they made? And usually on these sorts of things, my gut tends to be that it's always, to some degree at least, a mixture of nature and nurture. It might not always be exactly a 50-50 split, what causes, even just going beyond psychopathy, like just, certain personality traits and psychological traits in general. Is it nature or nurture? I think it's almost always some mixture of two. It might not be exactly 50-50 in all cases. It might be 80-20, for one thing, or 70-30 for another, and so on. But I was, I'll admit, gratified to read Robert Hare's take, because he's one of the leading experts in the world on psychopathy. Because Hare says that he very much believes that it is a mixture of both, but a particular type of mixture. Robert Hare says that he believes, quote, that psychopathy emerges from a complex and poorly understood interplay between biological factors and social forces, end quote. He says that there very much is strong evidence that inherent biological factors, like how a person's brain functions and a person's inherent personality, do set the stage, but then those factors influence how that person is going to interact with life and with reality and with other people. And all of this will cause them to not develop any real emotional connections to others or to evolve what we would think of as a conscience, the way that most people have done, to a large extent at least, as kids, often starting at the latest around the time they're a toddler, if not a bit earlier. Robert Hare elaborates on this as follows, quote, "This doesn't mean that psychopaths are destined to develop along a fixed track, born to play a socially deviant role in life. But it does mean that their biological endowment, the raw material that environment, social, and learning experiences fashion into a unique individual, provide a poor basis for socialization and conscience formation. To use a simple analogy, the potter is instrumental in molding pottery from clay being nature, in this analogy. But the characteristics of the pottery also depend on the sort of clay available, nature. Although psychopathy is not primarily the result of poor parenting or adverse childhood experiences, I think they play an important role in shaping what nature has provided. Social factors and parenting practices influence the way the disorder develops and is expressed in behavior. Thus, an individual with a mix of psychopathic personality traits who grows up in a stable family and has access to positive social and educational resources might become a con artist, or white-collar criminal, or perhaps a somewhat shady entrepreneur, politician, or professional. Another individual, with much the same personality traits, but from a deprived and disturbed background, might become a drifter, mercenary, or violent criminal. In each case, social factors and parenting practices help to shape the behavioral expression of the disorder, but have less effect on the individual's inability to feel empathy or develop a conscience. No amount of social conditioning will, by itself, generate a capacity for caring about others or a powerful sense of right and wrong. To extend my earlier analogy, psychopathic clay is much less malleable than is the clay society's potters usually have to work with." End quote. According to Hare, one result of this is that, based on his studies and those of others that he's, looked at and worked with, he writes, quote, "The quality of family life has much less influence on the antisocial behaviors of psychopaths than it does on the behavior of most people. Among the criminals who were not psychopaths, the quality of family background was strongly related to the age of onset and seriousness of early criminal activities," end quote. While in contrast, he writes, quote, "The quality of family life had absolutely no effect on the emergence of criminality in psychopaths," end quote. Very interestingly, Hare says that the average age that criminal psychopaths first end up in court is 14, regardless of family background and life experiences. If a psychopath becomes a criminal, average age they first end up, with something serious enough that it requires a court appearance is 14. Whether they had a relatively good, upbringing or a relatively bad one. In contrast with that, among non-psychopathic criminals, the average age of their first court appearance varies significantly based on their background. For a non-psychopath from a very troubled background, the average age that they will first appear in court for a crime was 15. Pretty close to the psychopath average age, regardless of background, while the average age of a non-psychopathic criminal who comes from a relatively decent background was significantly higher, 24. So psychopathic criminals tend to end up in trouble with the law around the same age regardless of background. But that doesn't mean that there's no difference between psychopaths from a relatively, good and stable background versus those from a obviously screwed up and dysfunctional one. The strong difference that does emerge between psychopaths from troubled backgrounds versus those from decent backgrounds, though, is in the nature of their crimes. Because those psychopaths who come from objectively, dysfunctional and troubled backgrounds tended to commit a lot more violent crimes than psychopaths who came from relatively benign backgrounds. And think about what all this means, when we're trying to think about, is it possible that a lot of the politicians who rule us and a lot of the corporate masters who are often their bosses or at the very least their, partners, if we're trying to figure out whether it's possible that a lot of these people are actually psychopaths, if your initial reaction is, well, it's hard to believe that they're all a bunch of Hannibal Lecters in their free time and just get away with it. Well, first off, Epstein shows that, it's not murdering, but that's some pretty evil shit. And a lot of them were doing that in their spare time. But, setting that aside, I am by no means saying that I believe that most of our political and corporate overlords are serial killers or something like that in the classic sense of the term. But what if that's because they're more likely to have come from relatively decent backgrounds, and while they're still psychopaths, it's just manifesting in terms of their behavior in different ways than the person who ends up being a serial killer or something like that. Now I'm going to go through a very kind of zoomed out version of Robert Hare's psychopath checklist. So he breaks the main symptoms of psychopathy into two categories. The first of which he calls emotional/interpersonal, by which he means personality. And I'm going to go through the main sort of parts or pillars of the personality symptoms of a psychopath. And again, as I'm going, think about how much of this applies not only to major corporate CEO types, but also to politicians, perhaps even more so. First personality trait is that psychopaths are glib and superficial, meaning they are witty and articulate and often seem to be great conversationalists and storytellers, though some people might be rubbed the wrong way by them, perceiving them as kind of insincere, fake, a little too slick, etc. Robert Hare writes of this, quote, "Astute observers often get the impression that psychopaths are play acting, mechanically reading their lines," end quote. However, unfortunately, many, perhaps most, if the psychopath is especially charming and or attractive, will still be taken in by them. They'll tell stories about accomplishments or claim credentials or expertise that are easily debunked, and yet through it all, they'll display what Hare calls, quote, "a smooth lack of concern at being found out," end quote. So they are superficially very charming, often perceived as charismatic as well. The next personality trait of a psychopath that Hare identifies is they are egocentric and grandiose. Holy cow, does that sound like most very high-level politicians, and some to an extreme degree. Robert Hare writes of this, quote, Psychopaths have a narcissistic and grossly inflated view of their self-worth and importance. A truly astounding egocentricity and sense of entitlement, and see themselves as the center of the universe, as superior beings who are justified in living according to their own rules. Psychopaths often come across as arrogant, shameless braggarts, self-assured, opinionated, domineering, and cocky. They love to have power and control over others and seem unable to believe that other people have valid opinions different from theirs. They appear charismatic or electrifying to some people. Psychopaths are seldom embarrassed about their legal, financial, or personal problems. End quote. And throughout the book, of course, Hare cites many specific examples from his own work, as well as kind of like, popular examples of psychopaths, like notorious serial killers or, in a few cases, even fictional famous psychopaths. But in regard to this, Hare refers to one psychopath that he had studied who would tell lots of stories about his childhood that would just, constantly, blatantly contradict themselves. Sometimes literally from one second to the next. The guy would say one thing about his childhood and then the next sentence or two later, he's saying just the exact opposite of what he just said. And Hare says that this man, quote, was a mile-a-minute talker with the psychopath's characteristic ability to contradict himself from one sentence to the next, end quote. Does this sound like anyone you know? Maybe not anyone you know personally, although maybe. But does it sound like any really famous, powerful, influential people that you can think of? Now, as I already mentioned a little bit a moment ago, oftentimes a psychopath to more astute observers comes across as arrogant. But unfortunately, many people interpret this arrogance as simply competence, perhaps mixed with charisma. And of course, this is often to their detriment if the psychopath is able to con or exploit them in some way. And I've heard many times from, people that I know and sort of trust their opinion, where they'll mention about some particular high-level politician that maybe they met at an event or whatever, and they'll talk about oh yeah, this person, maybe it's, a politician who doesn't sound that great when giving a speech or when on TV or whatever, but they'll be like, man, when he came into the room, he just sucked all the air out of the room and, all of a sudden everybody was charmed and there was almost like a palpable sense of this is a magnetic person or whatever. In Snakes in Suits, their book about so-called corporate psychopaths, Robert Hare and Paul Babiak write, quote, "It is the psychopath's arrogance that stands out so clearly to coworkers. Unfortunately, when dealing with higher-ups, the ability of psychopaths to manage and promote their arrogant self-perceptions and to package them as self-confidence and strong leadership effectively hides their true nature. Genuine modesty among psychopaths is so rare as to be non-existent. Its absence, while not an indication of psychopathy directly, can help to corroborate other suspicions." End quote. The next big personality trait of a psychopath is lack of remorse or guilt. These people, if we even consider them the same species as those of us, who actually have these things, these quote-unquote people simply do not experience any real guilt or remorse about the consequences of what they've done. And they will often, in interviews, be quite open about that, surprisingly so. Now, on occasion, they might fake remorse about something if there's a tactical advantage to doing so. For example, if they're speaking to a parole board and, are trying to get early parole. But often, even in those situations, number one, to an astute observer who understands psychopathy, they might be able to tell that the remorse isn't genuine. And on top of that, number two, the psychopath, him or herself, will, again, often contradict their own statements of remorse if they are pressed, and sometimes even when they're not pressed. And they'll often start very quickly rationalizing their behavior that they've just expressed remorse for, and then, 2 seconds later, they're rationalizing it as being justified or something, even if it was horrific behavior, even in a violent sense. So they'll do a little bit of fake remorse that some people will fall for and some won't. But then right after that, they're in defense attorney mode. They're in, justification mode. They're in excuse-making mode. Again, does that sound like any of our politicians? And psychopaths are very good at throwing up a whirlwind of excuses to shirk responsibility for whatever they've done. Sometimes, again, immediately after they've just claimed, at least, to feel remorse about it. As Robert Hare writes, quote, "In an ironic twist, psychopaths frequently see themselves as the real victims," end quote. He then refers to John Wayne Gacy as a prime example of this. And if you watch some Gacy interviews and things or documentaries that show him speaking a lot, you'll see this very often, where, he's just all over the place as far as the truth. And one moment he'll be claiming that he didn't kill someone, and the next moment it seems like he's admitting it, but then he's immediately claiming self-defense. And so you end up, if you're really thinking about it as you're watching him speak, you end up being left thinking like, this guy is trying to claim simultaneously, I didn't do this, and I did it, but it was purely, self-defense or whatever. And again, does this sound like any high-level politicians we might know? The next major personality trait of a psychopath is lack of empathy. According to Robert Hare, psychopaths have, quote, "a profound lack of empathy, an inability to construct a mental and emotional facsimile of another person. Psychopaths view people as little more than objects to be used for their own gratification. The weak and the vulnerable, whom they mock rather than pity, are favorite targets," end quote. And a little further on, he elaborates a bit more, quote, "In order to survive both physically and psychologically, some normal individuals develop a degree of insensitivity to the feelings and plights of specific groups of people," end quote. But, he says, quote, "For them, insensitivity is circumscribed, confined to a specific target group," end quote. And what he's talking about is, I think for the most part, people who, because of maybe certain jobs or roles, have to kind of put up a wall against feeling too much emotion, particularly empathy, for other people in certain situations and roles. So, for example, if you're a person whose job involves genuinely helping people who are really suffering in some way, it's very common for someone doing a job like that who is not a psychopath to, at least eventually, develop a bit of insensitivity to the people they're helping, simply to prevent themselves from being constantly depressed by what they're, seeing and hearing and witnessing and trying to help with. Another example might even be something like a surgeon who has to be very non-squeamish and very kind of cold and clinical when they're doing their job, assuming they're not just a psychopath who already is in that mindset 24/7. By contrast with people in that situation, psychopaths, he says, quote, "display a general lack of empathy. They are indifferent to the rights and suffering of family members and strangers alike. If they do maintain ties with spouses or children, it is only because they see their family members as possessions." Let me read that last line again. And again, just, do your own thinking about any prominent, powerful people that seem to be like this. If they do maintain ties with spouses or children, it is only because they see their family members as possessions. The next major personality symptom of a psychopath is that they are deceitful and manipulative. Robert Hare writes that psychopaths, quote, appear amazingly unfazed by the possibility or even by the certainty of being found out. When caught in a lie or challenged with the truth, they are seldom perplexed or embarrassed. They simply change their stories or attempt to rework the facts so that they appear to be consistent with the lie. The results are a series of contradictory statements and a thoroughly confused listener. End quote. Now, of course, non-psychopaths lie. Everybody does at least occasionally, if not frequently. And, some non-psychopaths lie more than others, but the difference with psychopaths is that it is like truly pathological, and it's done in kind of distinctive ways. Psychopaths will lie almost constantly. And sometimes it'll be for obvious reasons, like to con a victim into doing what they want them to do, or to get themselves out of trouble. But a lot of psychopaths lying seems also to be just because they like doing it, even when there's not really a clear reason for doing so. A lot of them, maybe even the vast majority, maybe even all, I'm not sure, seem to get like some sort of a kick out of doing it. And Robert Hare says that they often will seem proud of their skills at lying. And as an example, he refers to a female subject who had scored very high on his psychopathy checklist, who, when asked if she lied easily, said, quote, "I'm the best. I'm really good at it. I think because I sometimes admit to something bad about myself. They'd think, well, if she's admitting to that, she must be telling the truth about the rest." She also said that she sometimes salts the mine with a nugget of truth. If they think some of what you say is true, they usually think it's all true. End quote. Now, this next part is really interesting when you apply it to a lot of politicians and, really most extensively or, extremely, as of current year, Donald Trump. Robert Hare writes, quote, "Many observers get the impression that psychopaths sometimes are unaware that they're lying. It is as if the words take on a life of their own, unfettered by the speaker's knowledge that the observer is aware of the facts. The psychopath's indifference to being identified as a liar is truly extraordinary. It causes the listener to wonder about the speaker's sanity. More often, though, the listener is taken in." End quote. Hare quotes one psychopathic subject who was very slick and fast-talking and, told a lot of lies, but managed to sucker a lot of people, saying, quote, "If you throw enough shit, some of it will stick." End quote. And one of the things, by the way, that helps psychopaths to often be very effective at lying, despite the fact that a lot of the lies they tell should be easy to spot, is that psychopaths seem to have a very strong instinctive skill at quickly figuring out a person's weaknesses and vulnerabilities, and using those things in their deception and their manipulation of that person. This deceitfulness combines with that charming glibness to camouflage psychopaths in the eyes of many, sometimes even in the eyes of people who you would think really should know better. In Without Conscience, Hare describes a psychopathic subject whom he calls Ray, whom Hare encountered very early in his career, when he didn't yet have much of an understanding of psychopathy. And Hare writes this, quote, "Ray had an incredible ability to con not just me, but everybody. He could talk and lie with a smoothness and a directness that sometimes momentarily disarmed even the most experienced and cynical of the prison staff. When I met him, he had a long criminal record behind him. About half his adult life had been spent in prison, and many of his crimes had been violent. Yet he convinced me, and others more experienced than I, of his readiness to reform. He lied endlessly, lazily, about everything, and it disturbed him not a whit whenever I pointed out something in his file that contradicted one of his lies. He would simply change the subject and spin off in a different direction. Let me read those last couple sentences again. He lied endlessly, lazily about everything, and it disturbed him not a whit whenever I pointed out something in his file that contradicted one of his lies. He would simply change the subject and spin off in a different direction. End quote. Does that describe any high-level politicians that you can think of? In Snakes in Suits, Hare and Babiak write, quote, "Pathological lying is a hallmark of psychopaths. They cross back and forth easily between lying and honesty during conversations because they do not have the guilty feelings the rest of us have when we try to tell a lie. Their lies are always interwoven with a thread of truth, which, if questioned, they indignantly point out in their own defense. Questioning a well-positioned corporate psychopath's honesty can bring its own punishment in the form of retribution against the challenger." End quote. And all I'll say is just, look at how Trump reacts or responds when someone points out something he said that is just blatantly, objectively a lie. Sometimes he'll do the more common political thing that, most politicians will do, where they'll just try and pivot to a different subject, or they'll maybe try to subtly play the victim. He'll do it more blatantly, but he'll also, more so than most politicians, he will often respond with anger, with threats, with name calling, all these sorts of things. Now, when he's doing that to quote unquote journalists who are obviously themselves being manipulative and deceitful or trying to trap him somehow and, that sort of thing, a lot of us, myself included, often kind of get a little smile out of it. Yeah, you tell that journalist to, that they're a piece of crap trying to trap you into some sort of, verbal trap or whatever. But on the other hand, he reacts just as vehemently and aggressively when a journalist is actually pointing out a legitimate problem with something that he has said or that he's claiming is true, that's just objectively not true. And so while it's easy for me to feel sympathetic to Trump when he is calling out a journalist on behaving in some way that's, less than honorable, the fact that he responds in pretty much the same way, if not sometimes even worse, when someone calls him out on a legit thing that he's clearly lied about, I find that quite disturbing. And then the last major personality hallmark of a psychopath that Robert Hare identifies is that they have very shallow emotions. They just really don't experience feelings and emotions the way normal people do. They will sometimes claim to experience feelings and emotions, but when they are pressed, with follow-up questions, or, if they just on their own spontaneously try to elaborate on the emotions they're claiming to feel, it's often very clear, if you're paying attention, that they don't really feel these things like a non-psychopath does. They are aware of these sorts of emotions only in kind of an abstract theoretical way, not in a visceral experiential kind of way. And so if you know what to look for and you're really paying attention and you're not being lulled by their, charisma and glibness and whatever, you can sort of tell that this is a person who's trying to make you think that he experienced something that he is aware of the existence of and knows maybe a little bit of, superficial terms to try to claim that he's experienced these things, but that he really hasn't. Robert Hare quotes another psychologist saying of a psychopath and emotions that the psychopath, quote, knows the words, but not the music, end quote. And Robert Hare himself also uses the analogy of a psychopath is like a person who is to emotions what a colorblind person is to colors. They are aware that colors exist, but they don't really experience them. And so when they try to pretend that they experience them, again, it's like someone who genuinely can't see color trying to explain the experience of seeing a very colorful thing. Psychopaths also do not experience the physiological effects of things like stress and fear the way that normal people do. And this is what allows them to often be shockingly calm in situations where most people would not be, or to lie with a huge amount of seeming conviction, because they're really not feeling the same visceral feeling of fear that a normal person lying might feel if they believe there's a decent chance they might get found out. They might get caught in the lie. So those are the main personality traits of a psychopath. Now we're going to move on to what Robert Hare identifies as the main actual behavior traits of a psychopath, which are what he calls social deviance. So the first of these is that psychopaths are impulsive. He writes, quote, "Psychopaths are unlikely to spend much time weighing the pros and cons of a course of action or considering the possible consequences. I did it because I felt like it is a common response. Impulsive acts often result from an aim that plays a central role in most of the psychopath's behavior: to achieve immediate satisfaction, pleasure, or relief." End quote. So these are sort of like the ultimate in immediate gratification, in doing whatever is going to bring them whatever weird kind of positive feelings they experience in the moment. And unfortunately, those sorts of things that seem to provide psychopaths with the only kind of like positive, maybe emotions we would call them, that they ever experience are things that most of us consider immoral, or at least morally questionable. Like exercising power over others, dominating others, controlling others, getting themselves, very simple kinds of gratification of various types. Along with that, another behavioral trait of psychopaths is poor behavior controls. Not just in terms of impulsively trying to bring themselves short-term pleasure or something like that, but even in terms of like how they respond to certain social situations. So Hare writes that, quote, "Psychopaths are highly reactive to perceived insults or slights." Let that sink in. They are highly reactive to perceived insults or slights. End quote. Hare says that normal people have mental controls that inhibit, for example, crazily aggressive, over-the-top, disproportionate reactions to things like perceived insults. But that in psychopaths, by contrast, quote, "These inhibitory controls are weak, and the slightest provocation is sufficient to overcome them. As a result, psychopaths are short-tempered or hot-headed and tend to respond to frustration, failure, discipline, and criticism with sudden violence, threats, and verbal abuse. They take offense easily and become angry and aggressive over trivialities, and often in a context that appears inappropriate to others." End quote. Now you might be saying, wait a minute, CJ, a while back in this episode, you said that when psychopaths, use violence or something like that, they do it in kind of a cold, instrumental, callous sort of a way. But now you're saying that they have a temper, especially when they think they've been slighted in some way. But as Robert Hare explains, quote, "Their outbursts, extreme as they may be, are generally short-lived, and they quickly resume acting as if nothing out of the ordinary has happened." End quote. In other words, though they might quickly respond very aggressively, excessively so in the eyes of most people, to certain things, because they don't really experience emotions the way everyone else does, despite their outward behavior, they're not really feeling the intense visceral emotions that an ordinary person is experiencing when they lose their temper or something like that. Instead, they're behaving this way for a reason. As Robert Hare writes, quote, "Although psychopaths have a hair trigger and readily initiate aggressive displays, their ensuing behavior is not out of control. On the contrary, when psychopaths blow their stack, it is as if they are having a temper tantrum. They know exactly what they are doing. Their aggressive displays are cold. For example, when asked if he ever lost control when he got mad, an inmate who scored high on the psychopathy checklist replied, 'No, I keep myself in control. Like, I decide how much I want to hurt the guy.'" End quote. In other words, things like appearing very angry and even getting violent is actually, to them, kind of cold and instrumental. Meaning, it is all just a means to an end. And the end is usually, something that has to do with the psychopath satisfying their need for gratification. Which usually means something that is harming somebody else. So the end that this is instrumental towards might be different things specifically. It might be sex, it might be money, it might be power, or it might just be something that psychopaths seem to get some sort of pleasure out, which is the rush of just doing something that, is generally frowned upon by normal people. And psychopaths absolutely do seem to have a much larger amount of libido dominandi, right? The lust to dominate, the lust for power in order to dominate others than most other people do. Elsewhere in the book Without Conscience, Robert Hare tells the story of a psychopathic prison inmate named Gary Gilmore, who explained how it was that he earned the nickname Hammersmith. So the story is that a friend of his had been beaten and robbed by another inmate in prison named Bill, and he asked Gary Gilmore for help in getting revenge on this guy. And in Gilmore's words, quote, "That night I caught Bill sitting down watching a football game, and I just planted the hammer in his head, turned around, and walked off. How bad did I hurt him?" And he laughed. "They just kept me in the hole for 4 months and took Bill to Portland for brain surgery. But Bill was pretty fucked up anyhow. So, to answer your question, this guy nicknamed me Hammersmith over that. He gave me a little toy hammer to wear on a chain." End quote. Now you might be saying, wait a minute, this psychopath had a friend. I thought they didn't really have friends. Well, they do in a way. They'll have friendships with people that they believe benefit them in some way. But they don't really have genuine emotions of friendship towards the person the way a normal person would towards their true friends. It's much more transactional, but nonetheless, they might still be willing to do something pretty significant or even horrible on behalf of protecting the person who, at least for the time being, they perceive as a friend. And not just, physical trying to maim or kill someone violence, but also sexual violence by psychopaths. And they tend to, often engage in various types of sexual violence and abuse. Sexual violence by psychopaths also tends to be a lot more callous and instrumental than is sexual violence by non-psychopaths. It's much less driven by powerful visceral emotions. And Robert Hare says that he believes as many as half of all serial rapists are psychopaths. The next antisocial behavior trait that Robert Hare has on his list is that psychopaths have a very strong need for excitement. This tends to lead them to extreme, dangerous, and often violent behavior, and it also leads to a lot of drug use in many cases. It seems that due to the shallowness of their emotional experiences relative to non-psychopaths, that these sorts of behaviors are the only ways for them to really feel some sort of excitement or pleasure or a rush or whatever you want to call it, since often these are the things that would cause most normal people to feel a major surge of adrenaline. Now, for psychopaths, they don't feel fear and stress or physiologically react to it the same way that normal people do, but nonetheless, these extreme sorts of behaviors and situations seem to be the only thing that gives them any real strong feelings at all. So they tend to gravitate towards seeking various types of extreme stimulation, to live on the edge just to feel anything. And many of them will describe committing crimes and other, socially bad behavior as being motivated oftentimes by the fun of it or something along those lines. And as sort of a corollary to this, psychopaths are also often easily bored. So they're motivated by anything that might give them some sort of a rush, some sort of, for them, kind of gratification. And they seem to always gravitate as well towards money, power, and sex, which often are very intertwined throughout the darker corners of humanity, not just psychopaths, but money, power, and sex, any of them can be used to get more of the others. So like I said, psychopaths often are very, very focused on satisfying their impulses because it's one of the few things that really makes them feel anything. Not surprisingly, psychopaths often have very exaggerated, over-the-top sex drives and have little or no impulse control when it comes to those things. Which explains the behavior of politicians, among many others, and it's also why, not speaking specifically about politicians here, but about psychopaths in general, many of them appear to be, based on their behavior or are self-confessed, bisexuals. And many of them seem to derive a huge amount of pleasure from pulling others into their perversions and from exploiting and degrading others in sexual ways. So many of the famous psychopathic serial killers seem to be or are self-confessed bisexuals. John Wayne Gacy famously, constantly would characterize himself as such. And there are many other examples. One recent instance of this that's come to light is, look into the quote-unquote alleged behavior of P. Diddy or Puff Dicky or Puff Dookie or whatever the hell he's called now. But if all those allegations against him are even remotely in the ballpark of his real behavior, then he clearly has, in addition to the things we know about him for sure, he definitely seems to be a psychopath. The next major antisocial behavior on Robert Hare's checklist is lack of responsibility. Psychopaths just do not experience feelings of obligation or responsibility that normal people would feel in the exact same situation. And this can be seen in all aspects of their lives, not just in some. Now, some of these behaviors, of course, may be kept under wraps, at least for a long time, but generally, once you know a pretty clear picture of a psychopath's life and behavior, including the stuff that they maybe tried to keep secret for a long time, typically you find this lack of responsibility is just across the board. So, for example, if a psychopath has children, they can often be shockingly abusive and or negligent. They'll do things like leaving very young children alone if they, don't have a babysitter or can't afford one or whatever. They'll just leave, a couple of very young kids totally alone to fend for themselves. For an evening or, maybe for days. Or they might leave their children with a babysitter they know to be dangerous and irresponsible, and have no real qualms or guilt about doing so. They might leave their children with a babysitter they know is a drunk or a drug addict, or, is prone to physical violence or even prone to molesting kids. And they won't really think twice or lose any sleep about leaving their kids with such a person. As Robert Hare writes, quote, "Psychopaths see children as an inconvenience. Some insist that they care a great deal for their children, but their actions belie their words." End quote. Hare also mentions that people who knew they were HIV positive, but who continued to have unprotected sex with unknowing, uninfected partners may in many cases, in fact, be psychopaths. Because that's exactly the kind of thing a psychopath would do. So, you gotta wonder about Charlie Sheen, don't you? Or was he maybe just totally lost in drug addiction? Or is he a psychopath and his drug addiction was just, one symptom of it, because of what I've mentioned previously? Interesting to ponder. I don't know the answer to this, but was, Charlie Sheen's coming out as bisexual in that recent Netflix documentary just a psychopathic manipulation to get himself some sympathy and maybe even a little bit of woke bonus points? I don't know. But again, remember that psychopaths, very often are bisexual. But regardless of the truth about Charlie Sheen, and I am by no means claiming to have an answer on that, a psychopath's genuine lack of feelings of responsibility, plus their comfort and mastery of lying, will often allow them to talk their way out of situations that normal people would just never be able to do. So, for example, Jeffrey Dahmer did this multiple times that we know of, and probably plenty of other times we don't know of, where he's like transporting a body and the cops stop him and he manages to talk his way, out of them searching his car or whatever before they can find anything. Or one instance with Jeffrey Dahmer where one of his, victims escaped and Dahmer ran out after him to, grab him and drag him back to his apartment to torture him or whatever. And the cops, intervened, and Dahmer was able to very skillfully just sort of say like, oh yeah, we have a consensual relationship and this is basically just a gay lover spat. And he was so calm and convincing about it. And the cops, I guess this was back in the 70s maybe, or early 80s. And, people were still much more squeamish about anything having to do with homosexuality back then. And so a lot of times in that situation back then, a cop would be like, I don't want to get involved in a lover spat, between two quote unquote homos. And I think in that case, Dahmer's would-be victim, who became a victim, was drugged, and so, the cop just thought queers, as they would have said back then, having a lover spat and one of them's drunk, let's just send them home and, get this out of my face. But Dahmer might not have been able to talk his way out of those situations if he didn't have the psychopath's calmness and lack of responsibility and skill with lying and manipulation. In Snakes in Suits, Robert Hare and Paul Babiak write, quote, "Psychopaths rarely, if ever, take responsibility for their actions, even if they clearly made mistakes or their actions and decisions led to failures. But they go a few steps farther. They will not only blame others, but also create evidence that others are to blame. This takes effort, but psychopaths easily integrate it into their game, seizing on opportunities to bring harm to others' careers or professional standing. Clearly, this is a form of lying, and quite different from the shifting of blame or pointing fingers that most of us sometimes engage in." End quote. Another antisocial behavioral characteristic of psychopaths is that they exhibit early behavior problems. Most show serious behavior problems starting very young, even when they're not in a really messed up, abusive environment. While non-psychopathic kids will always show at least some degree of negative behaviors at various stages in childhood, and, certainly if they're in a very messed up household or whatever, it's going to be even more, but even so, non-psychopathic children usually do not exhibit negative behaviors anywhere near to the degree that psychopaths do at a very young age. Robert Hare writes, quote, "Because many children exhibit some of these behaviors at one time or another, especially children raised in violent neighborhoods or in disrupted or abusive families, it is important to emphasize that the psychopath's history of such behaviors is more extensive and serious than that of most others, even when compared to siblings and friends raised in similar settings." End quote. As many people probably know, cruelty to animals is a pretty common early indicator that someone might be a psychopath. And if they're asked about this as adults, psychopaths will often be very matter of fact, if not, outright positive, almost kind of like disgustingly nostalgic in their descriptions of themselves torturing animals as a child. They're also often very cruel to their siblings, engaging in all sorts of horrible behavior up to and including things like physical and sexual abuse of them. And then the last behavioral hallmark of a psychopath that Robert Hare identifies is, not surprisingly, what they grow up into, which is what he calls adult antisocial behavior. Of the way that those early behavior problems continue and often escalate into adulthood, Robert Hare writes, quote, "Psychopaths consider the rules and expectations of society inconvenient and unreasonable, impediments to their behavioral expression of their inclinations and wishes. They make their own rules, both as children and as adults. Impulsive, deceitful children who lack empathy and see the world as their oyster will be much the same as adults. The lifelong continuity of the self-serving, antisocial behavior of psychopaths is truly amazing." End quote. And I won't go into too much detail, of what that adult antisocial behavior might look like, because we've already touched on it throughout this episode so far, and probably will still more times, before this episode is over. But all kinds of criminal behavior, all kinds of abusive behavior, all kinds of deceitful and manipulating, con artist sort of behavior, exploitative behavior, doing evil and or dangerous and or risky things just to feel a rush, just because they felt like it, all these sorts of things. Lying constantly. And they really don't change. Their behaviors might become more sophisticated and or more extreme, but, the overall personality of the psychopath will be pretty much the same as an adult as they were as a very young child. I'm going to take a quick moment here to just let you know an important announcement, which is that I am going to be doing Amazon affiliate sales again, which I hadn't been doing for the last few years. I had some issues with Amazon for many years. I posted, Amazon affiliate links on podcast episodes, show notes, and on, posts on my website. And I ran into some issues with Amazon. They had some issues with me that they really didn't explain properly, and I had a hard time understanding what the problem even was. And then they asked me to jump through all sorts of hoops that were ludicrously onerous for me to have tried to deal with. So I just said, screw it. I'm going to stop doing the Amazon thing. But now, several years later, I've heard that it sounds like they're not being as much of pains in the ass as they used to be. And so, it would be very helpful to me to get some Amazon credits to help keep things going here. And so I'm going to, at least for the time being, start doing Amazon links again. And besides, Amazon has almost everything that you can buy. And, everybody buys from Amazon, even if they don't really love to do so. At least some things they get from Amazon. So I figure, why not help out your favorite podcaster when you buy those things from Amazon, whether you're really gung-ho to do it or just doing it reluctantly because it's the only place for the best price or whatever. So if you use the Amazon links on my website or in the show notes for this episode, and you get anything, not just, if it's a link to a specific product, not just if you buy that thing, but get anything from Amazon after going through one of my affiliate links, and I get a little cut of the sale, and it doesn't cost you anything. So you do the shopping you were going to do anyway, and old CJ gets a couple of shekels to help keep the lights on and help keep a roof over his head, so that I don't have to do all my podcasts from the silver bullet, if you know what I mean. So thanks in advance for doing your Amazon shopping after going through one of my links. All right, so one thing that I want to zoom in on a little bit here is that psychopaths are almost always characterized by an extreme degree of power lust, like an even bigger lust for power than most people exhibit. And related to this, they are very often, in one way or another, control freaks. In particular, they have a compulsive need to try to control everyone around them, to try to control, everybody who's in their circle or whatever. And I've already mentioned this in this episode a little bit, but I really do want to zoom in on it because it is just a very strong characteristic of them that also, again, seems to line up perfectly with a lot of the behavior of politicians, both on a macro and a micro scale. Some psychopaths may appear to have friends with whom they appear superficially from a distance to have a decent relationship, and some of them even appear to have good family relationships. But these are always, at the end of the day, instrumental or transactional, if not downright exploitative. And the fact of the matter is that psychopaths will abandon friends and family or throw them under the bus in some way without a second thought as soon as they believe that that person or those people no longer have anything that they want to exploit, or, if they can get something by betraying them or abandoning them, they'll do it. They'll toss what might have seemed to be a close friend or a family member with whom they appeared to have a decent relationship. They'll toss them under the bus without a second thought or the slightest twinge of guilt in order to obtain something better in terms of power or privileges or resources. Again, does this sound like the vast majority of politicians? And Trump, he's just more obvious and overt and blatant and almost proud of this than most. Most politicians will at least try to hide or downplay some of this sort of behavior or to excuse it away. And Trump is just upfront and blatant with this sort of thing. Look at how he has recently treated MTG and Thomas Massie as soon as they disagreed with him on, one of his important issues. And how quickly he became best buddies with Lindsey Graham and Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz, even though they had been some of the loudest, opponents of him back in 2016. But Trump sucked up to those guys and became their best friends and helped them out as soon as he believed it was in his self-interest to do so. Again, even though these people had been enemies of his for a while. But on a smaller scale than like national politicians, Robert Hare tells the story of a middle-aged subject that he calls Earl. And Earl was a guy who got a perfect or maximum score on Robert Hare's psychopathy checklist. And this guy that he calls Earl had started committing a variety of horrible crimes at a very young age. But Hare says that Earl, quote, has spent surprisingly little time in prison. He often avoided arrest or conviction, and even when arrested and convicted, he usually managed to get early parole. End quote. Hare quotes a psychological report someone else did on this guy, Earl, saying, quote, the most salient thing about him is his obsession with absolute power. He values people only insofar as they bend to his will or can be coerced or manipulated into doing what he wants. He constantly sizes up his prospects for exploiting people and situations. End quote. Earl was very skillful at playing both the inmates and the guards, and he would often rat out his fellow inmates if it was, to his advantage at all to do so. The same report says that Earl, quote, regularly informs on other inmates in an effort to save his ass and to obtain privileges. The con code means nothing to him unless he personally gets something out of it. End quote. By the way, Earl, not surprisingly for a guy who got a perfect score on the psychopath checklist, also exhibits a lot of other behaviors that we've already covered. Like, for example, Earl was a sexual predator, and he committed various types of sexual assaults and rapes against many women, including, by the way, his own daughter and one of her friends. And while he was in prison just with a bunch of dudes, Robert Hare says, quote, His propensities for sadistic sexual behavior carry over into prison, where he is well known for his aggressive homosexuality. End quote. Interestingly, Robert Hare says, quote, "One of the most striking features of Earl's personality is his grandiosity. Entries scattered throughout his files make reference to his dramatic, inflated, and pompous way of communicating. As one of my assessors wrote," and now he's quoting, another person that he worked with, "if I hadn't been so afraid of him, I would have laughed in his face at his blatant self-worship." End quote. So again, this guy who got a perfect score on the psychopath checklist, setting aside the personal violent behavior, at least potentially, in many other ways, exhibits a lot of behaviors that are very similar to a large percentage of politicians. So again, the only things in life that seem to give them anything that resembles pleasure are power, money, and sex, which, like I said, are all kind of intertwined with each other, and always in like an exploitative or dominating sort of a way. So they seem to have genuine fun dominating, exploiting, and controlling others. And they often openly express contempt for normal people as basically being just a bunch of weak, willing victims who are really asking to be exploited or abused. Now I want to zoom in for a while on the kind of overlapping Venn diagram of corporate and white-collar psychopaths. Because the reality is that, again, contrary to the popular stereotype, most psychopaths are not murderers. And many are not even violent, at least, not on a regular basis or to an extreme extent. As Robert Hare writes, quote, "The majority of psychopaths manage to ply their trade without murdering people. By focusing too much on the most brutal and noteworthy examples of their behavior, we run the risk of remaining blind to the larger picture. Psychopaths who don't kill, but who have a personal impact on our daily lives. We are far more likely to lose our savings to an oily-tongued swindler than our lives to a steely-eyed killer." End quote. Again, that old notion in the psychological literature that psychopaths tend to always be kind of like losers who are constantly in jail, constantly getting caught and punished and that sort of thing, constantly getting found out, is just simply not correct. It's based on a biased sample that researchers initially were only seeking out and studying psychopaths who were in prison. But as Robert Hare writes, quote, "Not all psychopaths end up in jail. Many of the things they do escape detection or prosecution, or are on the shady side of the law. For them, antisocial behavior may consist of phony stock promotions, questionable business and professional practices, spouse or child abuse, and so forth. Many others do things that, although not illegal, are unethical, immoral, or harmful to others. Philandering, cheating on a spouse, financial or emotional neglect of family members, irresponsible use of company resources or funds, to name but a few." End quote. And again, how many politicians do those sorts of descriptors characterize? So when we're talking about white-collar psychopaths, we're talking about psychopaths who are less physically violent or maybe even pretty much non-violent, who most likely had good or at least, mostly benign, relatively decent childhoods that were not crazy abusive or whatever. They likely have a higher IQ than a psychopath who's in prison for getting busted for some violent crime. They almost always will have more education and a lot more social connections. But again, it must be emphasized, still, they have no conscience, and they will still use their skills to rip off and exploit people without any remorse. Their skills, resources, and connections will often keep them out of prison. And even when they're, caught and convicted and sentenced, they often get relatively light sentences. And it's really ironic when you think about it that ordinary run-of-the-mill thieves and robbers tend to get much worse punishments for stealing, even though what they're stealing is often a lot less in terms of value. When compared to white-collar criminals who might steal way more money or resources, and then if they do get busted, they'll get a short sentence in a comfortable minimum security prison, while the guy who, robs a convenience store or steals a car or whatever, if he gets busted, he ends up doing more time in a much worse place. It's kind of fucked up when you think about it. Now, in terms of explaining why less violent or even nonviolent psychopaths from certain types of backgrounds might be drawn to the white-collar criminal world, aside from the fact that they probably already possess the perfect skill set for doing so, Hare writes in Without Conscience, quote, "White-collar crime is lucrative, the chances of getting caught are minimal, and the penalties are often trivial. In many cases, the rules of the game for greed and fraud carried out on a grand scale are not the same as they are for ordinary crime. Often, the players in the former form a loosely structured network to protect their mutual interests. They come from the same social strata and the same schools, belong to the same clubs, and may even be instrumental in setting up the rules in the first place." End quote. Wow, does that sound similar to like 99% of high-level politicians? Hare continues, quote, "A bank robber may be sentenced to 20 years in prison, whereas a lawyer, business person, or politician who defrauds the public out of millions of dollars may receive a fine or a suspended sentence, usually after a trial marked by long delays, adjournments, and obscure legal maneuvers. We condemn and shun the bank robber, but ask the embezzler to help us invest our money or join our tennis club." End quote. Hare quotes a prosecutor saying, quote, "The federal prisons for the wealthy and privileged have tasty food, jogging tracks, and libraries. The federal prisons for the rich and privileged are a national disgrace." End quote. And as Robert Hare points out, quote, "These messages are not lost on the psychopath who has a yen for the high life." End quote. In regard to the story of one very successful white-collar psychopath, Hare says that he, quote, "was aided by the common expectation that certain classes of people presumably are more trustworthy because of their social or professional credentials. For example, lawyers, physicians, teachers, politicians, counselors, and so forth generally do not have to work to earn our trust. They have it by virtue of their positions. Our guard may go up when we deal with a used car salesman or a telephone solicitor, but we often blindly trust our assets and our well-being to a lawyer, doctor, or investment counselor." End quote. And the same thing with, police officers and other law enforcement professionals, with military people in certain situations. Like, there's certain titles and credentials and jobs and things that people, and I don't think this is an accident, I think they're encouraged to do so from a very early age. People are kind of encouraged to, by default, think that their job or their title or their position means you should automatically trust them. And you shouldn't put up any defenses the way you might, again, is if you're dealing with like a seedy, fast-talking salesman trying to get you to buy a timeshare or something. And high IQ, well-educated and credentialed psychopaths know this. And it seems like many of them go into their jobs precisely so that they can exploit that trust and sort of the power and prestige of that position in the eyes of most of the public in order to do, worse things on a bigger scale than they otherwise could have, and to be more likely to get away with it. So there's now a lot of evidence that psychopaths are disproportionately represented amongst high-level corporate executives. One study indicated that psychopaths are represented amongst high-level corporate executives by a factor of more than 2 times greater than the rate of psychopathy amongst the population at large. I would love to see a really good study that tries to estimate what the level of psychopathy is amongst high-level politicians. Because I bet you the rate is even higher than it is amongst corporate executives. But for some reason, I doubt such a study will ever be done. Can't imagine why. Interestingly, there was a study many years ago that I read about that tried to figure out what were the top careers for psychopaths to be in, if they were, successful corporate psychopaths. So here are the careers in which this study says psychopaths are the most disproportionately represented relative to the overall population. CEO, lawyer, media, meaning like, TV personalities and people like that. Also, salesperson, not surprisingly. And by the way, I've always had a very strong spidey sense about seemingly slick, charming salespeople that like most people seem to get taken in by. I've always had like a very strong spidey sense where right away, when someone starts behaving that way, in a sales context, I'm like, nope, I'm not working with you. And I actually prefer the guy who is, a little bit unpolished, a little bit awkward at times or whatever, because he's probably not a psychopath. He probably has like some kind of conscience. And he's probably not as successful of a salesman as the guy who's the slick-talking psychopath, but I don't care. I'm not giving that guy a commission, and I'm not giving that guy an opportunity to fuck me over. Next one is surgeon, which is interesting, and it might be the most useful place for a psychopath to be. Because, they get to cut people open, which they might find exhilarating in some way, and they get rewarded and promoted if they do a good job and, save people's lives and whatever. But yeah, it seems like psychopaths might make good surgeons because they don't feel stress and fear the way most people do. And so this allows them, when they're doing some crazy open heart surgery or whatever, they're calm. So if only there was a magic way we could get every psychopath to just be a really well-paid surgeon, compensated enough for doing that they don't feel the need to, engage in any other horrible behaviors or whatever. But that's probably unlikely to ever happen. Next is journalist. Yes, journalists are a career group where psychopaths are disproportionately represented. Who could have guessed? And I would imagine, I don't think the study looked into this, but I would imagine that like the more you're at like a big corporate establishment news media outlet, the more likely you are to be a psychopath. That would be my hypothesis. Also, police officer. Yes, law enforcement has a disproportionate representation of psychopaths in their ranks. Surprise, surprise. Some crafty psychopaths realize, I like shooting people and, hitting people with a nightstick and pepper spraying people and harshly interrogating and abusing people. And man, if I have a badge, everyone's going to give me the benefit of the doubt. And I get to wield power over people and dominate them. Another one where psychopaths are disproportionately represented, clergy. And again, my hypothesis would be that the larger and kind of more corporate-like the religious institution in question, the greater the likelihood of psychopaths amongst the ranks of their clergy, and the smaller, churches and things probably have fewer of them, especially if they're just kind of like humble religious organizations or whatever. And I would suspect that mega church pastors and those sorts of people probably have a disproportionately high number of psychopaths amongst their clergy. The next is maybe another good one for psychopaths to be in where they can do some positive good other than surgeon, and that's chef. Again, probably because a psychopath is very cool and calm under pressure. And being a chef is often a very stressful job. So, as long as they're not cooking people and serving those up, as long as they're actually making the food that they're supposedly making, and they're just leveraging their ability to be very calm under pressure, then, okay. And then the last one is civil service, meaning government bureaucrats, meaning the people that run and man the ranks of Woodrow Wilson's administrative state, including the darkest part of it known as the deep state. So yeah, all those people that are running, the Pentagon and the intelligence agencies and the IRS and, all these other government agencies, they have a disproportionate percentage of psychopaths among their ranks relative to the general population. Interestingly, most of these occupational groups are people that I generally, as sort of like a default setting, don't trust and don't look upon positively. Not so much surgeon or chef, maybe. But, corporate executives, lawyers, people in television, media, and those sorts of things, salesmen, journalists, police officers, clergy, and civil servants. These are all groups of people that unfortunately many people, their default view of them is positive. But for me, they have not been, since I was pretty young and started to figure out that a lot of all these things are just scams. Interestingly, politician is not on this list, but I suspect it's probably because they didn't seriously try to study that, and it would be difficult to try and really study that, honestly. But when you keep in mind that lawyer and civil servant are on the list of the jobs with the most psychopaths in them, and then you also combine that with the behavior exhibited by most politicians, my case gets even stronger that we're ruled by psychopaths. Because what's the number one job that people have had prior to going into politics? If they're a politician, it is and has been since Abe Lincoln's day, lawyer. And politicians, they're at least nominally in charge of the government, and so it stands to reason a lot of them are psychopaths if there's a disproportionate number of psychopaths amongst the civil service that actually, makes the government run, such as it is. And now we increasingly have more politicians who are coming from the ranks of, being corporate executives before getting into politics, including Trump. And then we also have more and more people like getting elected to Congress, especially who previously had been civil servants at the CIA or the FBI or the Pentagon or whatever. A lot of people in the House, especially, seem to have been elected from those jobs in like the last decade or two. And some of those jobs I mentioned and others I didn't, but where problematic psychopaths have been observed and studied and, that sort of thing, are jobs where if you do that job, you interact regularly with very vulnerable people. So intelligent psychopaths who get the right credentials and get themselves into the right jobs, whether it's based on credentials that are real or fraudulent, either way, they get into jobs as doctors, therapists, teachers, childcare workers, I already mentioned clergy and some other things like that. They get into those jobs where, again, as part of doing their job, they have to interact regularly with highly vulnerable people. Now, there are people in all of those jobs who are not psychopaths and who are genuinely trying to help people with no, ulterior motive. But there are psychopaths in those jobs. And a psychopath in one of those jobs can get away with all kinds of horrible things for a very long time before they're caught, if they're ever caught. Like the person who gets a job as a counselor to help troubled kids and who is good at keeping up a positive seeming public face, who's good at masking, but then who behind closed doors is like sexually molesting every kid that comes through his charge. Or the priests molesting their altar boys. Or the doctors who in some way sexually assault their patients. These people, because they're psychopaths, are usually very skillful at keeping up a good public appearance and at doing things to prevent anyone from taking any of their accusers' accusations seriously, if accusations are ever even made. So, for example, a psychopathic teacher or counselor who works with troubled children might have one of his or her victims make accusations. But then it turns into a case of he said, she said, right? It turns into a case of this highly respected authority figure who might actually have genuine, non-fraudulent, impressive credentials. It's their word versus the accusation of a known troubled youth, a person who might be a young person addicted to drugs or who's been, doing bad crimes themselves as a child because they're troubled. Very often, psychopaths who do things like sexually abusing people will target the most vulnerable people who are going to have the hardest time having any accusations, if they make them, taken seriously by anybody. Interestingly, in Without Conscience, Robert Hare has a section on corporate psychopaths in which he mentions a case study from Paul Babiak, the same guy that he would later collaborate with to write Snakes in Suits. And it's about a man whom they just called Dave. And Dave was in his 30s and was on his third marriage with 4 kids when he was ID'd as a problem employee by his immediate boss at some unnamed large corporation. And Babiak was consulting with this corporation, I guess, to try and identify employees who had, real personality disorders or something like that. And so Dave was a guy who had interviewed very well for the job that he had, but then when he got his first big opportunity to turn in a big report or something, it was full of plagiarized material, and his immediate boss caught it. But then Dave managed to talk his way out of it, brush it off, whatever. But then as time went on, other employees in Dave's department kept coming to that boss and complaining. And it seemed that Dave was the source of just tons of conflicts and problems throughout this department. These sorts of problems continued until Dave's supervisor discovered that there were irregularities in his expense account. And then Dave's supervisor decided he was going to go to his boss about Dave. And when he did so, he discovered that Dave had already been going over his head to that same boss to complain about him, right? Dave's immediate supervisor, for quite a long time. Now, this easily might have gone against the supervisor who was trying to do the right thing, but ultimately the supervisor was able to figure out a way to prove to his boss that Dave was the real problem. But even when that guy was persuaded that Dave was the source of most of the problems in the department, it turned out that people even higher up the chain had already been kind of seduced by Dave's charm, and they ultimately took his side and protected him, protected Dave from any kind of major disciplinary action. Robert Hare writes of this, quote, "What interested Babiak most about this case was the fact that while those closest to him were convinced of Dave's manipulations, irresponsibility, and lack of integrity, those higher up in the organization had been convinced by Dave of his management talent and potential. Despite clear evidence of dishonesty, they were still charmed by him. Dave's ability to manage the discrepant views of these two groups of people led Babiak to seek a more systematic evaluation of his personality. Not surprisingly, Dave received a high score on the psychopathy checklist. Dave has actually been quite successful from an organizational point of view. He's had 2 promotions in 2 years, received regular salary increases despite a negative evaluation by his boss, and has been included in a corporate succession plan as a high-potential employee. Babiak also sees him as successful from a psychological point of view, owning to his ability to manipulate upper management into believing his view of things for more than 2 years. This is especially notable when we realize that his peers, subordinates, and immediate supervisor saw him exhibiting behaviors and traits that researchers normally ascribe to psychopaths." End quote. So yet again, this idea that psychopaths in a corporation or another kind of large organization, maybe even a government bureau or something, the idea that they'll quickly be found out and fired or whatever is just not true in many cases. Might be true of some. So this guy whom Robert Hare, calls Dave, clearly exhibited skills that psychopaths often have when they're in this sort of corporate world. And under the umbrella of corporate world, I would include working in something like a government bureaucracy or agency. So a slick psychopath will often be very smooth and charming and a master suck-up to those who are sometimes one step above him in the chain of command. Sometimes, if they don't get on well or don't, if their voodoo doesn't work on their immediate supervisor, they'll go, 2 or 3 steps above and make sure to try to charm those guys. And in general, the larger and more complex an organization is, the easier it is for a psychopath to kind of do his thing and rise up the ladder. So they'll charm the people above them as much as they possibly can and manipulate them. And then those below them in the chain of command, though, they will often exploit and screw over and, take credit for the work of others, that sort of thing. And they'll create conflict. Sometimes they'll do sort of a small-scale divide and conquer strategy. And so a lot of times what you'll find is that a psychopath in an organizational structure might have a lot of people under him in the chain of command who don't like him or who see him as a problem or whatever, and are at least somewhat wise to what's going on. But very often, most or all of the people above him in the chain of command don't see it that way. They think he's great. And so, when somebody low down on the totem pole comes and complains to somebody above the psychopath in the chain of command, that higher level person will kind of already be biased towards the side of the psychopath and will tend to just see the employee complaints as kind of frivolous, griping against your boss and that sort of thing. But like I said, in general, the larger and more complex an organization is, the easier it is for the psychopath to play his game successfully, for longer, and rise ever higher up the chain. It's a lot harder for them to play their game successfully for any length of time in a much smaller organization or company. And if any of you have ever worked for a while for like a giant corporation or some, giant government agency or whatever, and then you've also spent some decent amount of time working in like a little company, say a company that's small enough that it doesn't have a separate HR department and where the owner of the company actually knows all of his employees by name and interacts with them fairly frequently. In those sorts of organizations, it's a lot harder for the psychopath to play his game and not get found out. So when I was working as a professional diver, scraping the hulls of boats about 1.5 years ago, that was a small enough company that the owner of the company knew every employee by name. And he and his manager were really able to keep tabs on who was doing what. And so it was really difficult. Not that I was, trying this, but I did see some other employees who were not so great and, really not being conscientious and doing their job well. They weren't able to get away with it very long. And it was a lot harder for them to do things like shift blame to others for their own failings and mistakes and so forth. And you really had to just do a good job because it was small enough of a company that the owner and, your supervisors really knew you, really kind of knew what you were up to, and really could tell who was actually doing a good job and who was just, trying to give minimum effort and keep under the radar and maybe try to blame others or whatever. So in our world of gigantic corporations and vast government bureaucracies, there are just ample opportunities for psychopaths to do their thing successfully for quite a while, and often end up in very high positions. And there are particular kinds of groups and organizations as well that psychopaths are often drawn to for different reasons. In their book Snakes in Suits, Robert Hare and Paul Babiak talk about some of the organizations and positions that psychopaths are often drawn to, aside from just big corporations. One such type of organization that psychopaths are often drawn to are so-called affinity groups of various types. Hare and Babiak write, quote, "Affinity groups, religious, political, or social groups in which all members share common values or beliefs, are particularly attractive to psychopaths because of the collective trust that members of these groups have in one another. As long as the psychopath can accurately espouse those beliefs while in the presence of group members, their true motives are less likely to be discovered. Religious belief groups, open to new members joining their group from all lifestyles, readily assume that those who join them hold similar beliefs and values, and tend to focus on professed beliefs and values to forgive past transgressions. These noble qualities, unfortunately, make them easier targets for manipulation by unscrupulous fraudsters. While most people join affinity groups to associate with those who share their values, beliefs, and interests, psychopaths join to take advantage of them by hiding behind a well-defined set of personal expectations." End quote. And a little bit later on in the book, they write, quote, "Like all predators, psychopaths go where the action is, which to them means positions, occupations, professions, and organizations that afford them an opportunity to obtain power, control, status, and possessions, and to engage in exploitative interpersonal relationships." End quote. In fact, psychopaths are, not surprisingly, especially drawn to leadership positions in certain types of organizations because, quote, "In particular, the opportunity to get a leadership or management position is extremely attractive because these positions offer the psychopaths a chance to exert power and control over people and resources. They tend not to require involvement in the details, and they command larger than average salaries. Because a leader's ability to get people to do things is often of more importance than his or her technical capabilities to perform work tasks. Pretenders lacking in real work experience are not disadvantaged. Their talents are assumed, and their phony or exaggerated backgrounds often accepted at face value." End quote. So yeah, if you've ever been in the situation, and most of you probably have at one point or another in your life, if you've ever been in a situation where you were pretty sure or maybe even knew for a fact that your boss was not capable of doing your job, and you kind of wondered, like, wait a minute, this guy can't even do my job. Why is he the boss or the supervisor of a bunch of people with, the same or similar job when he himself can't possibly do any of our jobs? Well, this might be why. Because while they're not good at maybe doing the actual technical tasks of whatever job it is, they are good at rising up hierarchies, and they are good at manipulating people, and they're charismatic and charming and so forth, and so they're able to get themselves into leadership positions, often ahead of people who are actually much more qualified at whatever the job is. Another type of organization that comes to mind that psychopaths are often especially drawn to are any kinds of organizations where there is a large amount of secrecy involved in what the organization does. And of course, the ultimate example of this are intelligence agencies. And I would wager that if we had any way to actually verify this, that you would find that even if I'm correct that psychopaths are disproportionately represented amongst politicians and quote-unquote civil servants and so forth, that the highest concentration would probably almost certainly be found in the intelligence agencies. Because if you think about it, by definition, they are secretive, and by definition, a lot of the things that are part of their job daily are things that are considered, at minimum, immoral, and in many cases are often illegal. So if you're a smart, high IQ psychopath, yeah, you might go to the Department of Agriculture or the FDA and do some horrible things for the sake of your career and your personal profit and so forth. And I'm sure that such people exist in those organizations, but imagine how much even more attractive it might be to the unscrupulous, well-educated psychopath to go to work for the CIA, or the FBI, or the Office of Naval Intelligence, etc., etc. So, Hare and Babiak write, quote, There is another aspect of organizational life, whether business, military, religious, or government, that facilitates the entry, manipulation, and deceit of the predator. Secrecy. End quote. The authors admit that some types of secrecy in certain types of organizations might actually be appropriate for the purpose of the organization. And some aspects of secrecy might be kind of inadvertent. For example, an organization where there are kind of like information silos in different departments, where different departments and even different levels within the same department don't communicate with each other very well, can result in de facto secrecy, even if it's not like a deliberate choice on the part of those running the organization to have it be secretive. However, Hare and Babiak point out, quote, regardless of the appropriateness of the secrecy, the impact is often to increase the levels of distrust among the employees, reduce the levels of management credibility or perceived trustworthiness in the eyes of those kept in the dark, and to increase mistakes made due to lack of timely, accurate information. End quote. Not surprisingly, they say, to a psychopath, an organization with a lot of secrecy is very much a target-rich environment. They write, quote, secrecy is the pretender's friend. The success of psychopathic manipulation, especially in large groups of people, depends on maintaining a cloak of secrecy about what is really going on. A culture of secrecy in an organization makes it much easier for predators to hide. Let me repeat that one more time. A culture of secrecy in an organization makes it much easier for predators to hide. What kind of organizations have a real culture of secrecy? Hare and Babiak continue, and much harder for management to catch them in their lies, to accurately rate their performance, or to see the abuse they heap on coworkers. End quote. And of course, I would point out that that's even assuming that psychopaths wouldn't be even more heavily concentrated at or near the top of large organizations that have a strong culture of secrecy. I strongly believe, of course, that psychopathy would be more likely the higher up you go in such an organization or institution, whether it's one that's nominally private or public. Because A, that's where the power is, and psychopaths are compulsively drawn to power. And B, psychopaths have the perfect skill set for quickly rising through the ranks of an organization characterized by power and secrecy. In Snakes and Suits, Hare and Babiak also mentioned the problem with earlier understandings of psychopathy based on biased samples. They write, quote, early research by psychologists and psychiatrists suggested that the behaviors of most psychopaths were too dysfunctional to make long-term survival in organizations possible, and that they might be better suited to work on their own or in some other career. But based on our own research and that of others, we now know that some organizations actively seek out and recruit individuals with at least a moderate dose of psychopathic features. End quote. They might be looking for charismatic, persuasive people who are strategically kind of Machiavellian, and they might see these as strengths to the organization, but a psychopath fits the bill. Hare and Babiak point out that psychopathic traits can easily be mistaken for good leadership qualities, and that charisma, which is very common among psychopaths, is a very powerful camouflage to mask major personality problems. They write, quote, the ability to influence events and decisions and persuade peers and subordinates to support your point of view are critical executive management skills. When found, it is hard for decision makers to look past it. We know that psychopaths are masters of conning and manipulation, especially if covered over by a deceitful veneer of charm. leading to the perception that they have strong persuasion and leadership skills. End quote. So as we've already kind of mentioned, psychopaths are very good at spinning a web of bullshit about their past accomplishments and their future, goals and things they want to accomplish. They're great at spinning a completely bullshit, but very believable to the gullible observer, web of all the things they've done and all the things they're gonna do. And their charisma allows them to lull many people into believing it, even though in many cases, the psychopath has no real intent or even realistic ability to do those things, but it can con and seduce a lot of people. Heron Babiak write, quote, "Visionary thinking, the ability to conceptualize the future of an organization, is a complex skill requiring a broad perspective, the ability to integrate multiple points of view, and a talent for looking into the future. That is, to think strategically." Now listen to this line, or the next couple of sentences. "Psychopaths are not good at establishing and working toward long-term strategic objectives. They are much more opportunistic. Yet, they can weave compelling stories about situations and events of which they know very little into surprisingly believable visions of the future. Because visioning is so difficult for the average person to understand, it is little wonder that the vague but convincing, illogical but believable, rambling but captivating, and compelling but lie-filled discourses of the psychopath can look like brilliant insight into what the organization should do. This is especially true in times of crisis, when few can make these lofty predictions and many are looking for leadership to fill the vacuum." End quote. Wow. Does any of that describe the way some of the worst actors in government and politics operate? Weaving totally unrealistic but very seductive sounding visions of the future of the organization and, all the good things that'll happen if we just believe in the psychopath, will be greeted as liberators. This time, I promise, the regime change war idea is going to work like a charm. It didn't work the last 27 times, but let's not talk about that. This is why it's so important to stay, as much as you can, objective and critical when listening to people in leadership positions and that sort of thing. And it's very important, if you want to keep your wits about you, that you focus on what the person is actually saying and whether or not it makes sense and whether or not it's plausible and whether or not there's any attempts at manipulation going on, rather than allow yourself to get lulled by some combination of a person's good looks and charisma and seeming, extreme confidence in everything they're saying, and their body language and all those things can lull you into believing a lot of bullshit that you might not believe if, for example, you just read a transcript of what the person said and did so with a critical eye. And I always think about how very often in the aftermath of, let's say, a presidential debate, most of the mainstream coverage, analyzing it after the fact, and a lot of normies, people who are only sort of casually political and only really pay attention to politics around election time, what they'll say after a presidential election, they'll often focus on superficialities. You'll hear people saying things like, "Oh man, I liked this candidate so much more. He sounded so much more presidential. He sounded so much more confident." And there's often little to no real analysis of the substance of what was actually said. Now, to be fair, much of what was said is not of real substance anyway. But even that should be revealing that, hey, we might have a couple of psychopaths pretending to debate each other on substance, and there's really almost no substance there. And Hare and Babiak talk about this a lot. Under the, amusingly ironic heading Style trumps substance, the authors write, quote, "In many cases, what is actually said is the least important part of a social interaction. The content of the message is often obscured by the manner in which it is delivered and by the visual impression the speaker makes on us. Politicians, advertisers, and salesmen are not the only ones who understand that looking good and sounding good often blinds people to what should be obvious to them. Distortions of the truth, empty cliches, hyperbole, and fatuous nonsense." End quote. Wow, does any of this sound like many of our politicians? Particularly the very successful ones? As well as celebrities, major media personalities, and so forth. Interestingly, by the way, just as a little aside, in at least a couple of places in the book Without Conscience, which was published in 1993, Robert Hare makes explicit reference as an example of a probable psychopath to Robert Maxwell. Yes, the father of Ghislaine Maxwell, Jeffrey Epstein's girlfriend and pedo trafficking partner. And his references to Robert Maxwell are in the book's section about corporate psychopaths. And they mostly talk about him as being, an example of a seemingly psychopathic corporate executive billionaire type. Now, I honestly don't know if Robert Maxwell's Mossad connections were publicly known in the early 90s. If they were known at all to the general public at that time, and if so, to what degree. Or if there were even just rumors or whatever, I just don't know. And Hare doesn't mention any of Maxwell's intelligence connections when talking about him. And like I said, he just sort of talks about him as an example of a very bad corporate CEO psychopath who does a lot of shady business deals and who manages to keep his darker side largely unknown to the public through various shady means. Now, Robert Maxwell undoubtedly was all of that, but when you work in all of his illegal intelligence activities and add in what we know for a fact about his daughter and her good buddy Jeff, then the case for Maxwell being a psychopath becomes even more overwhelming. So I'm guessing that when Without Conscience was published in the early 90s, that Maxwell's intelligence connections and a lot of that stuff, right, his background in the sort of world that Epstein obviously was plugged into when he came along, that those things were not well known. And, for sure, I doubt, I'm almost certain, that even if some of these things might have been known to some people, they weren't being discussed at all in the mainstream media. Even if some of this information on Maxwell may have been theoretically publicly available. So I don't necessarily blame Hare, given all that, for not knowing about Maxwell's intelligence connections in the early 90s, since it's possible nothing or very little of that might have been available to the public at the time, and also Robert Hare is a psychologist and not a dangerous historian. So we've covered some of this already along the way when discussing, what a psychopath is and how they operate and so forth, but I want to zero in for a little bit on this question of how do psychopaths successfully con so many people? Because a lot of times when you read the story of a psychopath conning people, and you're doing so as a neutral observer, and you're not, being personally charmed by the psychopath, and you're just reading about their actions and just reading transcripts of things they said, you look at it and go like, how could anybody fall for that? And yet many people do. Well, Hare says that the job of the psychopath, quote, is made a lot easier simply because a lot of people are surprisingly gullible with an unshakable belief in the inherent goodness of man, end quote. He then tells the story of a psychopathic con man who really kind of sounds like John Wayne Gacy light, by which I mean John Wayne Gacy minus the serial killer stuff. A seemingly successful nonviolent psychopath, quote, who became man of the year president of the Chamber of Commerce and member of the Republican Executive Committee in the small town where he resided for 10 years. End quote. This guy claimed to have a bunch of impressive credentials, including a PhD in psychology, that helped him get a position on his town's school board, and that he was intending to seek higher office as a state rep. Then a local reporter actually bothered to do the job that reporters are supposed to do and looked into all of the credentials and things that he claimed to have and found that virtually all of them were totally false. And on top of that, the reporter discovered that this guy had been in all sorts of trouble over the course of his life, including a stint in Leavenworth Penitentiary and, all sorts of phony identities and all this shady stuff. Now, if you're rational and you're the type of person who tends not to fall for psychopath con games, you might think, well, that must have been game over for that guy, right? Au contraire. Robert Hare writes, quote, "When found out, this man was unconcerned and stated that he knew that if he was ever discovered," and then these are his words, "those trusting people would stand behind me. A good liar is a good judge of people." And now, back to Hare's words, he writes, "His only embarrassment was that it was merely a local reporter who had found him out." End quote. But it gets even crazier. As Robert Hare writes, quote, "Perhaps most remarkable in this account, though by no means unusual, was the fact that far from decrying this fellow's outrageous program of deception, the local community he had conned so thoroughly rushed to his support. And it was not merely token support they offered. I assess his genuineness, integrity, and devotion to duty to rank right alongside of President Abraham Lincoln," wrote the Republican Party chairman. Presumably, he was more swayed by the impostor's words than by his deeds. Or perhaps he and the rest of the community could not come to grips with the fact that they had been taken in. This, of course, makes life a lot easier for the con artist and the fraud. Most of us would be devastated and humiliated by public exposure as a liar and a cheat, but not the psychopath. He or she can still look the community straight in the eye and give impassioned assurances on their word of honor. End quote. Remember that Mark Twain quote at the start of this episode. And think of how often, for example, Trump's most ardent remaining supporters will vehemently double down and defend him when you factually state just how much he has gone, in the second term, completely against almost everything he campaigned on that earned him their support and their votes in the first place. It's like a bizarre version of Stockholm Syndrome, driven in part maybe by the fact that these people might know deep down they've been just completely conned, and it's too tough on their self-esteem and their worldview to admit it. These people are, at least to some degree, willing fools. As Robert Hare writes, quote, "The sad fact is that the psychopath's need for self-gratification is often easily satisfied because some people are quite willing to play the role of victim. In some cases, the individual simply refuses to believe that he or she really is being taken advantage of. For example, the husband of one of our female psychopaths vehemently denied the credibility of reports from friends that his wife was cheating on him. He remained convinced of her virtue even after she ran off with another man. Psychological denial is an important mechanism for screening out painful knowledge from conscious awareness, but it can also blind us to truths that are obvious to others. Some people are immune to the truth because they manage to distort reality to make it conform to their idea of what it should be." End quote. Whether conscious or unconscious, everybody has a strong potential for self-delusion. And so if somebody is successfully taken in by a psychopath, That vulnerability to self-delusion is easily exploited by the psychopath as a way to kind of like recruit this victim into a defender of their victimizer, even after the victimizer's victimization has been completely exposed to any objective observer. Also keep in mind that psychopaths are masters of spotting people's psychological weak spots and then pushing whatever buttons they need to push to get what they want out of that person. And they're often especially skillful at applying this kind of natural talent to selecting their victims or their marks. In a way, it's sort of analogous to, that a lion won't go after a big, strong, healthy wildebeest. He'll go after the very young or very old ones, or the ones that are already, wounded or crippled in some way. For example, Robert Hare mentions a psychopath who, quote, never stalked attractive women, end quote, but instead targeted less attractive women because he, quote, could smell insecurity the way a pig smells truffles, end quote. So they'll often target the lonely or those who have, obvious self-esteem shortcomings and things like that. And they're almost always masters at quickly sizing you up and figuring out whatever your personal feelings of inadequacy might be. And figuring out how to play those either by, kind of attacking them or by pandering to the inverse, right? So like an unattractive woman, a psychopath might treat her as if she's very attractive to con her into his clutches, or he might, depending on what it is he's trying to get her to do or get out of her, he might attack those insecurities. Robert Hare even mentions Clarice Starling's first encounter with Hannibal Lecter in Silence of the Lambs as a good and very realistic example of this being done. And, if you've never seen the movie or read the book, you probably have, but if you haven't, there's a scene where on her first meeting with Hannibal Lecter, this young rookie FBI agent, Clarice Starling, gets her buttons pushed because Lecter is able to kind of read her and size her up very quickly. He hits her vulnerabilities about her kind of poor background and humble, upbringing and everything like that, calls her, among other things, poor white trash, because he knows very quickly in their first interactions that she's got insecurities about this. And so it allows him to sort of like gain some initial power over her. On the subject of psychopaths' pathological lying and how often people are actually taken in by these lies, even though very often they are lies that should be pretty obvious to detect and debunk, Hare writes in Without Conscience, quote, "What makes psychopaths different from all other liars is the remarkable ease with which they lie, the pervasiveness of their deception, and the callousness with which they carry it out. But there is something else about the speech of psychopaths that is equally puzzling: their frequent use of contradictory and logically inconsistent statements that usually escape detection." End quote. And throughout the book, Hare cites a variety of examples of this, including one case where there was a man in prison for stealing who was being evaluated as a psychopath, and he was asked if he had ever committed a violent offense. And his answer was, no, but once I had to kill someone. Things like that. Maybe not always as dramatic as admitting to killing someone after you just said that you haven't committed any violent crimes, but where even in the space of a few sentences, you say one thing and then almost immediately say something else that contradicts what you just said. And yet a lot of people are not going to actually detect and call out the psychopath for obvious lying. And there is something really distinctive about the speech patterns of a lot of psychopaths that, again, when I was watching the interviews with John Wayne Gacy and thinking about, various high-level politicians, including Trump, where it's like their lying is in such a way that should be obvious, even, within their own speech, even within what they're actually saying, where you may not even need to go Google things to see if any of what they're saying is true or false, where you can just say, wait a minute, in sentence 1, he said this, in sentence 2, he said that, and these are two things that are mutually exclusive, therefore he must be lying about one of them. And the fact that psychopaths often mix truth and falsehood together in these bizarre ways, and it almost seems like they don't even know they're lying sometimes. And they'll have these bizarre patterns of jumping around in their speech in ways that, again, should be off-putting to somebody who's paying attention, but often slips under their radar for one reason or another. Robert Hare says, quote, "It is as if psychopaths sometimes have difficulty in monitoring their own speech, and they let loose with a convoluted barrage of poorly connected words and thoughts." End quote. Does that sound like anyone prominent that you can think of? And it's different from other liars. Robert Hare says that this is because the brains of psychopaths work differently from those of non-psychopaths in a lot of ways, including how their brains do language, both in terms of the hardware and the software of their brain, so to speak. So of the hardware, the language functions of psychopaths seem to be coming from both hemispheres of the brain, not just one, as is the case with most people. And on the software side, because psychopaths don't really experience or understand emotions, they might not appreciate the emotional impact of words. And Robert Hare quotes lines from the literature on psychopathy like, "He knows the words but not the music," or "He exhibits a facility with words that mean little to him, form without substance." Robert Hare's own preferred analogy, and I think I referenced this earlier in the episode, is that when it comes to words and emotions, a psychopath, quote, "is like a colorblind person who sees the world in shades of gray, but who has learned how to function in a colored world," end quote. So, a colorblind person might not know what red really is, but he has come to learn that when the top light on the stoplight is on, that means stop, even though he can't see red and doesn't really know what it is. So when it comes to language, the psychopath, quote, "has learned the words that others use to describe or mimic experiences that he cannot really understand," end quote. And Hare says that to a psychopath, quote, "a word is just a word," end quote. And for some reason, to me, the whole idea of, well, it depends on what the meaning of the word is, for some reason comes to mind. And again, the two most prominent sort of occupational groups I think of exhibiting this sort of thing are politicians and lawyers, and most politicians are also attorneys. Interestingly, Hare says that you can sometimes spot a psychopath by how he or she uses their hands when they're speaking. Now, everybody uses hand gestures when they're speaking. Oftentimes we do it even when we're talking to someone on the phone and we can't see each other. And sometimes hand gestures have a very kind of concrete or literal meaning. Like, for example, if you're describing how big of a fish you caught, you might hold your hands apart and say, "I caught a bass this big," or whatever. But the fact is that most hand movements that people do while they're speaking have no literal meaning. And these gestures are called beats by people who study this sort of stuff. Beats somehow seem to help people put certain types of thoughts into words. And Robert Hare says that there is evidence that, quote, "psychopaths use more beats than do normal people, particularly when they talk about things generally considered emotional," end quote. And he points out that people, not just psychopaths, but everybody, people tend to exhibit more of these beats when they're kind of struggling to put something into words. So, as a mundane, non-psychopathic example, he mentions a tourist in France who barely speaks the language trying to ask for directions is likely to have way more hand gestures than they normally would, if they were home in the States asking someone in English for directions. And that's basically what psychopaths are doing when they're trying to mimic normal people's emotions and describe those emotions through speech. Also, when compared to normal non-psychopathic people, the thoughts of psychopaths seem to be organized in their minds into smaller, what Hare calls packages. He writes, quote, "Psychopaths' thoughts and ideas are organized into rather small mental packages and readily moved around. This can be a distinct advantage when it comes to lying. Skilled liars are able to break down ideas, concepts, and language into basic components and then recombine them in a variety of ways, almost as if they are playing Scrabble. But in doing so, the psychopath endangers his overall script. It may lose its unifying structure or become less coherent and integrated than if he were dealing in large thought units. For this reason, the competent liar often uses a thin truth line to help keep track of what he says and to ensure that his story appears to be consistent to the listener." End quote. And so, if a psychopath is spinning a word salad of deception, they're moving around thoughts, ideas, and concepts in their head in smaller packages as if they're Scrabble pieces. And so on the one hand, this gives them that agility with the truth. And some people will be taken in by that, but it also means that they will have all these contradictions and things, or, where you're looking at the whole of what they said, you end up coming away like this is incoherent. But a pattern that often happens is they'll come back to a main point, which, in some cases might even be true. This sort of truth line. They'll sort of circle back to a point. And it almost seems like they might be keeping themselves from getting too fragmented when they're doing so. Again, can you think of any prominent people whose speech patterns kind of look like this? Interestingly, Hare points out that even though psychopaths lie very frequently and often get away with it, in a way, they're actually not that good at it. And, quote, "Their speech is full of inconsistent or contradictory statements. Their truth line is fragmented and patchy at best." End quote. And then he refers back to that reference that I mentioned before of a thief who, in the same sentence, said he'd never committed a violent crime, but also that he once killed someone. And Hare says of this, quote, "Most of us are able to combine ideas so that they are consistent with some underlying theme. But psychopaths seem to have difficulty doing so. This helps explain the wild inconsistencies and contradictions that frequently characterize their speech." End quote. Some people will catch these inconsistencies and contradictions, but many will miss them, especially if they've got some other reason to want to believe this person. And I would point out that in politics, oftentimes someone being a member of your team, of your party, is enough for you to be, whether you realize it or not, wanting to believe them and wanting them to be right and telling the truth. And so the same individual who might actually catch all the inconsistencies and bullshit in a speech or an interview by someone of the other party's team will be completely taken in by an equally flawed and contradictory word salad that's made by a member of their team. And these sorts of contradictions and, logical problems and inconsistencies in psychopath speech, Hare compares to a movie that's got continuity problems. Say half of a scene is shot on a cloudy day where it's kind of dark, and the other half of the same scene is shot on a very sunny day, and they're edited together. Some moviegoers will catch this, but many won't. Especially if they're really engrossed in and distracted by other aspects of the movie. If there's, some compelling action going on, or some really interesting dialogue, or, they're just totally sucked into the movie because it's been really entertaining or whatever. And the fact is that skilled psychopaths know how to put on a good show that's enthralling to many people. and many people will miss what should be glaring continuity problems in what the psychopath is actually saying. Hare also says that because psychopaths organize their thoughts into smaller packages than the rest of us do, combined with the fact that they don't really understand emotions, that this causes them to make what objectively are, or at least should be, kind of like jarring choices of words and blatant contradictions and things. Psychopaths' speech, like their thoughts and behavior, is also affected by the fact that they lack the self-monitoring that most of the rest of us have. So they're not really self-monitoring their own speech like other people in real time as they're speaking, and they probably aren't consciously aware of how much of their words are contradictory with their other words. So it sounds like it should be easy to spot them for the liars that they are, but the truth is that for many normies, this is not so. So my takeaway from all of this is that psychopaths' minds naturally hyper-compartmentalize their thoughts, and this is reflected in their language. It makes them, in a way, skilled liars, but it also means that their lies are vulnerable to someone who's really paying attention objectively. Sort of like that moviegoer who watches the movie and nitpicks all of the continuity problems or plot holes or whatever. So at the end of it all, how are psychopaths so often able to lull many people into not seeing their bullshit for what it is? They put on a good show. Again, just like that movie that's so engrossing that you miss what should be glaring continuity problems. Many people will just get so wrapped up in the kind of superficialities of the psychopath's communications that they don't see through to the problems with the content of what they're actually saying. Robert Hare writes that, quote, "Although psychopaths may talk a lot, they are not necessarily skilled wordsmiths. It is primarily the show, not the eloquent use of language, that attracts our attention and cons us. Good looks, a touch of charisma, a flood of words, contrived distractions, a knack for knowing which buttons to press. All these can go a long way toward obscuring the fact that the psychopathic presentation is nothing more than a line. We ordinarily pay more attention to what someone says than to the accompanying nonverbal behavior. Hand gestures, facial movements, smiles, eye contact. However, when the speaker is attractive and gives a really impressive nonverbal performance, the effect can be reversed. We watch the show and pay little attention to what is said." End quote. So what can us non-psychopaths do to try to protect, or at least to insulate us as much as possible from being conned by psychopaths? One of Robert Hare's main suggestions to avoid being taken in by them is, quote, "Try not to be influenced by props. Don't pay too much attention to any unusually captivating characteristics of people you meet. Dazzling looks, a powerful presence, mesmerizing mannerisms, a soothing voice, a rapid-fire verbal pitch, and so forth. Any of these characteristics can have enormous sleight-of-hand value, serving to distract you from the individual's real message." End quote. He suggests, quote, "The next time you find yourself dealing with an individual whose nonverbal mannerisms or gimmicks, riveting eye contact, dramatic hand movements, stage scenery, and so forth, tend to overwhelm you, close your eyes or look away and carefully listen to what the person is saying." End quote. And that's another thing that I don't remember if we've mentioned earlier in the episode or not, but people who make riveting eye contact, right? People who will always make strong eye contact and hold it for longer than most people and so forth. A lot of times people on the receiving end of that will perceive it as charismatic and other, positive attributes like that. But sometimes it's just another method of a psychopath in putting on a show and distracting you from what they're actually saying, and how it is often what should be easy to debunk bullshit. Read the text of a beloved politician's speech or a transcript of their interview, and read it with a critical eye to look for contradictions and evidence of deception. And a lot of times you'll spot those things a lot easier than if you're sitting there, watching the person deliver a speech in real life in front of you, or watching them on TV when they're putting on a show. These sorts of things can potentially prevent you from being taken in by a psychopath to begin with. But then, what do you do when you perhaps wake up to the fact that you have been conned in some way by someone who might be a psychopath? Again, a lot of people are going to either pretend they don't see it, or to double down on their belief in the psychopath and defend him from critics who are pointing out the obvious lies that the person is telling them, and so forth. And partly, this is an ego defense mechanism where, like Mark Twain said, it's easier to fool a man than to convince him that he's been fooled, because if he has to admit to himself and to others that he's been conned, then he feels like a sucker. Under the heading, What to Do When You Realize You Have Been a Pawn, which is towards the end of the book, Snakes in Suits, the authors write, quote, "Eventually, the unexplained lies, inconsistencies, negative feelings, and feedback from friends and family reach a point when the victim begins to realize that he or she has been a pawn in a psychopath's game. It may take a lot of validation and a lot of time for the realization to sink in. Once you understand what has happened, you may feel like a patsy or a fool. Many former victims report saying to themselves, 'How could I have fallen for these lies?' or 'I'm such a fool.' This is a normal feeling, but it is not without its costs. People who feel like fools wish to hide their foolishness. Rather than seek out confirmation or validation of their new view of the psychopath, they tend to avoid others." End quote. And I think you can definitely see this when people will double down on their support of a politician even after he or she repeatedly and blatantly violates their own stated goals and ideology, which had attracted the supporters and voters in the first place. Some significant percentage of Trump supporters, for example, seem like they will never withdraw their support of him, no matter how much his own promises and rhetoric he completely violates with his actions in blatant and obvious ways, all the while gaslighting people, claiming that he's delivering on his promises, even though 90% of the time, at least, in the first year of this second term, he's been violating those exact promises and campaign rhetoric and so forth. Instead, these sorts of supporters will go into apologetics gymnastics mode, often laced with a lot of partisan rhetoric. They'll trot out the 4D and 5D chess, and they'll play the lesser of two evils argument and all these sorts of things into just a stew of justification, trying to explain away the fact that they have been conned, and they seem to want to continue to be conned. And of course, the last bastion will be something along the lines of, well, at least he's better than the Democrats and he's owning the libs or whatever. And I think a lot of what's going on in those cases is ego defense, probably mostly subconscious. Rather than admit to anyone, or even consciously to admit to themselves, that they've been conned, that they've been played for suckers, they will pretend to themselves and to anyone listening that they have not been conned, even when all of the objective evidence indicates that they have been conned really, really badly many times. Instead, they'll just come up with an endless list of excuses and justifications. Well, his hands are tied by Congress. Well, the deep state is resisting him too effectively. Unfortunately, he's got some bad advisors who sometimes give him bad advice. Trust the plan, it's 4D chess, he's still better than the Democrats, etc., etc., etc. And a lot of this is probably motivated by conscious and/or unconscious shame. And on the subject of shame over having been conned by a psychopath, Hare and Babiak write, quote, "Shame is a natural response to abuse. Because of this, many abusive situations go unreported," end quote. However, they argue that, quote, "You do not deserve to feel shame, just as you did not deserve to be abused. It was not your fault. The psychopath is a predator and you were a target and victim. It is just as easy for a psychopath to use your own shame against you as it was to use your flaws, lacks, and fears in the first place. Do not let shame for being conned prevent you from seeking help and guidance. Do not let the psychopath use it as a weapon against you," end quote. I think the problem with not realizing and admitting that you've been conned by a psychopath is really twofold. First, it means that you don't really learn anything yourself from having been conned, which means you're just as likely to keep getting conned in the future. And secondly, it means that the psychopath will get away with their con. And they won't be deterred at all from continuing to do what they've been doing, to, do more con jobs in the future, maybe on an ever-increasing scale. Because the more a psychopath successfully cons people without negative consequences, the more they will, not only keep doing it, but keep doing it on an ever larger scale. And here's a hard truth. As of now, there is nothing remotely resembling a cure for psychopathy. And there's no effective treatment for it, despite decades of people trying various things. The real problem seems to be that psychological therapies are only effective, if they are effective, in helping people who, at least on some level, realize they have a problem and want help and want to change. But the problem with psychopaths is they never feel this way. In their own mind, they are very happy and satisfied with how they are. They don't see themselves as in need of any help or fixing or curing whatsoever, and they look down on people who are not like them. In fact, when it comes to therapy, putting psychopaths in psychological therapies, for example, for an incarcerated psychopath, right, requiring him to participate in some sort of therapy, whether it's one-on-one with a therapist or in a group setting or whatever, these can help lots of people who are not psychopaths. But with a psychopath, these things often do more harm than good. Because the only thing psychopaths seem to really get out of therapy is learning new techniques to get inside people's heads and manipulate them. And on top of that, a clever psychopath who is in prison may go through some sort of therapy, may even choose it voluntarily, and then use, that credential of, oh, I went through this therapy or whatever, to pretend that it has helped them and that they've changed so that they can do things like persuade a parole board to let them out early. But they're not actually fixed. And if they really are a psychopath, they're likely to go back to doing what they were already doing, that got them locked up in the first place, or maybe even something worse. Because the recidivism rate of psychopathic criminals is twice the rate of non-psychopathic criminals. And the violent recidivism rate of psychopaths is triple the rate of non-psychopathic criminals. And unfortunately, because psychopaths tend to be so persuasive, they're often very good at getting people to believe that, they've realized the error of their ways and they've changed. And a lot of times they'll use participating in therapy of some sort, or, another one they'll often do in prison is joining like a religious organization in the prison. And, they'll pose as like, oh, I've been saved. I've seen the light. I'm no longer going to be the, bad guy I was. And if they're a psychopath, This is just a story. When a psychopath claims that, oh yeah, these things I got busted for in the past, like I've realized the problem with them and I'm going to do better going forward and I've, changed and whatever, when they say it, if the person saying it is a psychopath, it is never true. So far, there is nothing that fixes or cures psychopathy, and there's nothing that even really has a good track record of even producing significant improvement that's sustained over time in a psychopath's behavior patterns. As Robert Hare and Paul Babiak write, quote, "To a large extent, the personalities of psychopaths are carved in stone. There is little likelihood that anything you do will produce fundamental, sustained changes in how they see themselves or others." End quote. So there's no cure for psychopathy, at least not currently. I mean, I guess you could argue that a guillotine or something is a pretty good permanent cure, but, setting that aside. There's no real cure for psychopathy, at least currently, so the only option, really, for us non-psychopaths is to try to understand psychopathy better so that we have a better chance of spotting it and then insulating and defending ourselves from them as best we can, combined with trying to do things that deter or discourage psychopaths from engaging in their worst behaviors and that remove them from society in some way when they're caught. By the way, one of my favorite examples of a society who had a pretty good way of dealing with psychopaths are the Inuit. The Inuit have a term that is, I'm probably not pronouncing it right, but kunlungeta, that translates from their language as something along the lines of people who just won't do the right thing. And what they describe by that term seems to be a textbook psychopath. These kunlungeta do not go out, to hunt, which is the work of traditional Inuits. They do not go out hunting with the rest of the men in the village. They hang back and, don't do any real work. And while the rest of the men are out hunting, they will seduce the women of the village, that sort of thing. And they just won't change. And the great thing about a small tribal society, kind of like a very small business or a very small church organization or something like that, is that it's a lot easier for people to really come to know the true character of their fellow members of that society or that organization, right? The boss of a company with a couple dozen employees, all of whom he knows by name, is more likely to really pick up on someone who's a bad actor. And so, a group of Inuit are going to quickly come to know who maybe isn't pitching in on the work and everything for some legitimate reason, maybe he's injured or sick or whatever, and who is just full of shit and is behaving like a psychopath. And I give the Inuit a lot of credit. They don't fuck around with psychopaths. Their solution was simple. Once they realized that one of their fellows was a psychopath, they would simply push them off the ice whenever they had a chance. Problem solved. Not only do you get rid of a psychopath, but you also prevent him from reproducing himself by removing him from the gene pool. Hopefully you did it before he had a bunch of kids with other dudes' wives. So if only there was a realistic means for us to deal with corporate and political psychopaths in the same way. But obviously that's not feasible when we're talking about these giant, powerful organizations with all these resources and where, it's often kind of hard to really know somebody's character. To really know, is this a redeemable person who just made some mistakes, maybe got seduced by corruption and power and whatever, or is this just an unrepentant psychopath who will never get better no matter what we do? So when looking at our current political world, and, what we can do about what I believe is a real psychopath problem. The fact that our institutions and organizations of government and also the corporate world almost seem like they're designed to select for psychopathy, particularly in the higher levels of power. And that furthermore, psychopaths are likely to be drawn to those exact types of organizations and institutions. what can we do? Well, I think our only options realistically in the foreseeable future are something like number one, trying to educate as many regular people as possible about the true nature of psychopathy, what it really is, what it really looks like. And secondly, trying as much as we possibly can to make reforms to our systems that do a better job at deterring, identifying and weeding out, and disincentivizing psychopaths from getting into powerful positions and doing all the worst things they are capable of with that power and prestige. And I'm the first to admit that that is a very tall order, but I just don't see any other real way of reducing the harm that is caused by corporate and even more so political psychopaths. For what it's worth, this podcast episode has been my humble contribution to the first, part of my solution, which is just trying to get people to even realize what a psychopath really is like and how large of a proportion of our politicians and civil servants and corporate executives consistently exhibit textbook psychopathic behavior. And just by way of conclusion, I'll say that obviously I have extensively referenced and cited Robert Hare, sometimes on his own, sometimes with his co-author Paul Babiak, and I will say that Robert Hare explicitly warns against people who are not trained experts trying to diagnose people as psychopaths. So let me say explicitly for the record, I am definitely not claiming to be a trained expert in the credentialed sense. And I'm certainly not saying that my opinion on who is and isn't a psychopath should be taken as any kind of dogmatic gospel. My claim about certain types of people and even certain individuals is not to be taken as definitive in any sort of legal, medical, or scientific sense. However, I will say that I hope you'll at least consider my perspective and opinions on this stuff, because I am and have been for a long time a very serious student of human nature and human behavior, and I'm an avid reader and researcher of many fields related to understanding humans, including not just history, but I've also done a pretty fair amount of reading about a lot of other aspects of understanding people, like psychology, economics, sociology, aesthetics, culture, political science, and so forth, both in the classroom context when I was a university student, and then in the decades since then as I've just continued to do my own research because I'm intrinsically interested in these things. Now, my main field, and the one that I'm the most credentialed in, is history, and my reading in all of these other aspects of social science and humanities and whatever is partly so that I could better understand history, which is, of course, my primary field, and partly it's also just out of innate curiosity. I'm someone who has a very high degree of openness as a personality trait, which means I'm curious about lots of things. So while I'm not a credentialed psychologist and don't claim to be, I am a credentialed historian. So that does mean that I have gone through a social science graduate program. And it wasn't psychology, but, I think a lot of the info that's out there, including but not limited to the work of Robert Hare, is actually very comprehensible and understandable to the educated layman. Right? The guy who is interested and reads and thinks a lot about psychology, but hasn't, gotten a master's degree or a PhD degree in it or whatever, and isn't a credentialed therapist. In other words, someone like myself. Because of my background and having gone through graduate school for one discipline of social science, I'm able to understand and make sense of academic work in most social sciences most of the time. It's only when it's something that's really esoteric jargon specific to that field that I might have a hard time. And even then, if it's something I really want to try to understand, I can just do the work of looking up the jargon and, coming to understand terms that I previously didn't know. So, for what it's worth, while I'm not claiming that my views on who is and is not a psychopath should be taken as gospel in a legal, medical, or scientific way, I still think they should at least be given serious consideration. And as one more kind of informal credential that I'll throw out there, I am somebody who was diagnosed, only about a year ago, late in life, with ADHD. Now, I've had it my whole life. It's not something that, suddenly attacks you when you're in your 40s or whatever, but it was only about a year ago that I finally started to put it together and, went and was diagnosed by a credentialed, professional in the field. So there's a lot of things about ADHD that people do not understand, that they just don't know, or that they have misperceptions about, including myself up until, a little over a year ago. And part of the reason that I never suspected until fairly recently that I might have ADHD is that I had a lot of those blind spots and misconceptions about the condition myself. And so I would look at sort of the popular stereotype of ADHD and go, that really doesn't fit me in most instances. But now that I know that I have it and I have a much fuller and more accurate understanding of what the condition is and how it can manifest, one of the things that's pretty common amongst ADHD people is that they tend to be more sensitive to other people and other people's emotions and moods and these sorts of things than most people are who don't have ADHD. And in addition, people with ADHD tend to be better at quickly spotting frauds, liars, people like that. In other words, people who in many cases may be psychopaths. And there's some complex reasons for why this is. Why are ADHD people often better at spotting, bad actors who are being manipulative and deceptive before a lot of normies do? And ADHD people are very likely to be people who sort of fit the stereotype of empaths. Now, I don't believe in that as like a supernatural kind of a thing, but I think it's more like we have a much more finely attuned sense for picking up on other people's moods and intentions and so forth. In a way, it's almost like we're the opposite of psychopaths in that we have too much empathy and sensitivity to not only our own emotions, but those of others. And at least part of the reason why ADHD people seem to often be this way is because we have a harder time growing up as kids than most neurotypical people. And studies have actually shown that on average, a child who grows up with ADHD will get criticized, reprimanded, and so forth around 20,000 more times over the course of their entire childhood by, some combination of parents, babysitters, other relatives, siblings, teachers, counselors, authority figures, whatever, than children who don't have ADHD. Because all of our problems with things like organization, time management, tasks completion, general, tidiness, all these things that we struggle with mean that we get way more criticisms, reprimands, sometimes subtly, sometimes passive aggressively or sarcastically, sometimes blatantly. But this causes us as a defense mechanism to become extra sensitive to other people's emotions and intentions and moods and all these sort of like micro things. And the downside of it is something called rejection sensitivity dysphoria, which I won't get into here for the sake of time, but which you can look up if you're curious. Rejection sensitivity dysphoria, RSD. I have it bad. But ADHD is one of those conditions that, like many conditions, has downsides and upsides. And one of the upsides of having been, criticized and reprimanded and so forth 20,000 more times as a kid growing up, and being extra sensitive to the emotions and, intentions and things of others, is that on average, an ADHD person is a better detector of bullshit and a better detector of people who exhibit psychopathic behaviors. And I've known this about myself my whole life, even though I didn't know it was ADHD and I didn't have good terminology to explain it. But I knew from a very early age that I was better than most people at spotting when someone was trying to con someone, including myself. When someone was clearly being manipulative or bullshitting, even when the person who was, trying to be deceptive was superficially very charming, very likable, saying all the right things, very slick, I was always able to spot those people as the snakes they are before most other people. And this has protected me in my personal life a number of times. So I'm saying that aside from the fact that I've been informally studying psychology in addition to, history, economics, all these other things for decades at this point, I also have the inherent superpower of the ADHDer of figuring out when someone's trying to bullshit me a lot faster, oftentimes in a few sentences of conversation, than other people. There have been multiple cases where, somebody comes into my life, I meet somebody for whatever reason, and they seem to be very likable and slick and charming and whatever, and other people around me who are also interacting with this person are completely taken in by them and are like, oh, this person's, so nice and so likable and, blah, 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 blah. And I'm right away like, this person I do not trust. My spidey sense is tingling. The sort of like love bombing behaviors that sometimes psychopaths will use to lull people into their confidences, or that are often used by people trying to recruit cult members and things. Those sorts of things, like, right away are red flags to me. And anytime someone is clearly too slick and is clearly putting on a show, and, I'm able to just sit there and keep my concentration on what they're actually saying, and like the person looking at the movie for continuity errors, I'm sitting there going, wait a minute, this contradicts that, wait a minute, he said this, I know for a fact that's not true, blah, blah, blah. So, it's not a formal credential, but I do seem to be better than most people at spotting bullshitters. And the most masterful and also the most dangerous bullshitters of all are, of course, psychopaths. So unfortunately, there will always be some percentage of people among us who are psychopaths. And unfortunately, as long as there are large, complex, hierarchical institutions that have a lot of power, either, direct coercive power or economic power, psychopaths will be disproportionately drawn. If they're not, like retail violent criminals or serial killers or whatever, if they're more of like your educated, white-collar corporate psychopath type, those types of people will be disproportionately drawn into those institutions and organizations. They will be disproportionately drawn to positions of power in those organizations, and they will often rise quite quickly, quite high in those institutions and organizations. Because their personality disorder is also kind of like an ideal skill set for deceptively moving up the totem pole of those organizations and exploiting them for their own purposes. And in a lot of ways, a psychopath who rises into a high position, say in politics or, in an intelligence agency or something like that, they might not be personally violent, like with their own hands, though some of them are. But even if they're not, they might actually end up doing a lot more damage. And even in a way, taking a lot more lives than someone who's just a low-level serial killer or something like that. I mean, John Wayne Gacy killed 30-some-odd people that we know of. But a lot of presidents have the blood of hundreds of thousands or even millions on their hands. So ponder that. Thank you for listening to this episode. If you've made it all the way to the end, I really appreciate it. I hope that you got something out of this episode. I really put a lot of work and effort into it, so I hope that you've got some value out of it. And I appreciate your time. And before I close it out, I'll just say that I could really, really use your help. If you like what I'm doing and want me to be able to keep doing it and hopefully be able to do more of it, down the road, then I really do need your help. Please help to spread the word of the Dangerous History podcast to anyone you think might be interested in it any way you can. And please consider supporting my work financially if you're able to and want to see it continue and grow and so forth. One of the best ways that you can help me out is to become a regular supporter of mine on Patreon. And then also, there are other ways you can help me out as well. There will be PayPal and Venmo links in the show notes for this episode, as well as a Bitcoin address that you can send Bitcoin contributions to. And I also do have a P.O. box that you can send stuff to if you wanted to send me stuff like a check or, a handful of cash or whatever, a little sack of gold dust or something like that. But if you like what I do and want me to be able to continue doing it, I really need your help. And so please consider contributing to help keep me afloat, because it's really rough right now. I mean, the economy is crap in general, I know, and a lot of people are hurting. And if you're hurting, please don't give me your money if it's going to cause you to not be able to put food on your family, as W. Bush said. So 1,000 thank yous in advance, and I hope to talk to you again soon.